Welcome to AJAX Essential Training. My name is Dory Smith, and I'll be your guide through this introduction to the world of AJAX. I'm teaching this class because I've been programming for over 30 years, working with JavaScript for over 10 years. I've written 6 editions of the best-selling JavaScript and AJAX for the web Visual Quick Start Guide for Peachpit Press with Tom Negrino. And I've spoken about JavaScript and AJAX at conferences all over the United States and the world. Previously, I also did the JavaScript Essential Training course for lynda.com, and I hope that this class also suits what you're looking for. So now that you know who I am, let's get started with AJAX. If you're a premium member of the lynda.com online training library, or if you are watching this tutorial on a disk, you have access to all exercise files used throughout this title. The exercise files are arranged by chapter number, with each chapter and each exercise being broken down. Inside many of the exercise folders, there's a finished folder, which contains the completed version of the project done in that exercise. If you're a monthly or annual subscriber to lynda.com, you don't have access to the exercise files, but you can follow along with the lessons, and you're still able to read the code from the screen and type it in yourself. Let's get started. In this movie, I want to talk about what AJAX is. And this is actually a concept where there's a certain amount of controversy. But I'm going to talk about what it is traditionally and what's going to be covered in this course overall. And handily enough, these two are the same. AJAX, in its original name, XML HTTP request, started up when Microsoft shipped IE5. It had this cool capability where, without leaving the web page you were on, it could go talk to a server, get some data, and come back without reloading an entire page. It could go out, ask about something, then come back, and then update the page based on this new information. Or update a server, and then come back, but without the page refreshing. Over the years since IE5 shipped, other browser makers have all said, hey, this is kind of cool. And they've shipped their own implementations of it, to the point now where all modern browsers have support. A couple of years ago, Google realized that plenty of browsers had the support, and so they decided to use this technology to work with their maps. You go to Google Maps and you look for, I'm in Ventura, California, and we're by the ocean, so maybe I want to have sushi for dinner. So here we get a list of sushi places in Ventura, California, and as I'm looking through it, I can zoom in, scroll around, go from place to place, and decide where I want to eat. Let's check out I Love Sushi. That sounds like a good place. But the point is that if you notice, all of this is happening and the URL isn't changing. We're still at maps.google.com. And this was a revolutionary idea when it first started up. A lot of other people had been doing small-scale or internal exercises with this technology, but nobody else had done it yet in a big way. So companies started to look more into this, and the next thing that happened was that a guy named Jesse James Garrett in early 2005 found that his consulting company was recommending this XML HTTP request technology to a lot of their clients, but that nobody wanted to say XML HTTP request because it's kind of a pain. So he came up with a new name, which he termed AJAX, which stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Asynchronous means that your browser isn't hanging while it's going and talking to the server. You can still be entering data on the screen, you can be scrolling around, but during that time, there's a request being sent off to the web server, which will come back when it has the requested data, and update your screen with whatever it needs to update. So it's asynchronous, Java, and XML. XML is the last part of it. XML is what is transferred back and forth between the server and the browser. Now, things have expanded a little bit in terms of it doesn't have to be XML. It could be HTML. It could be another protocol called JSON. But in its strictest sense, it needs to be asynchronous, it needs to be JavaScript, and it needs to be some type of data passing back and forth between the server and the browser. So this is what this course is going to be talking about: asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Next up, I'll be covering what AJAX is not. In this movie, I want to talk about what AJAX isn't. The term has gotten somewhat confused because it can be hard for the average person to look at a browser and know whether or not something is AJAX. Consequently, even people who should know a little bit more about what they're talking about have gotten confused and have said things are AJAX, or this is great AJAX technology, or great use of AJAX, even though it isn't. So in this movie, I want to talk a little about things that aren't AJAX and why they aren't. For instance, YouTube is not AJAX. Some people might think it is just because it does kind of interesting stuff and there is interactivity and animation, but you can tell right away that it's not just by right-clicking on something, and you can see that it is actually Flash that's doing those movies. Here's another one that catches a lot of people. Google Maps are AJAX. There's no question. They were the first big company to ship an AJAX-enhanced page. Now, you might look at Yahoo Local Maps and think that it's AJAX-enhanced because it does many of the same things that AJAX maps do. Ooh, that's a little much. For instance, in the same way that I said in the previous movie, I can say, put in Ventura, California, and I'll get Ventura, California here. And again, I can scroll around in the same exact way that I could using AJAX. But again, you know that this isn't AJAX by right-clicking, and you can see that it's actually Flash. This one's actually surprised a lot of people, I know, because they were sure that it actually was AJAX, but it isn't. Now you'd think, well, Google did some great things with AJAX in the first place, so Google Finance would of course also be AJAX. And they do some amazing things in Google Finance. For instance, I can change how long this graph goes for, and it does some neat stuff. I can change how long it's going to go for in Zoom, and you can see it's not reloading the page. For some reason, I'm not sure why, once again, it's Flash. Which is not to say that everything that isn't AJAX is definitely Flash. There's a lot of things that are neither AJAX nor Flash. For instance, here's a game. Hopefully you're not offended by hurting bunnies. Well, maybe if I just keep missing them, it won't matter. Whoops, that one I actually hit. And people think that this is AJAX, but it isn't. Because what it is here is just plain old JavaScript. There's nothing AJAX-y about this. It does not go and talk to a server. This is all just animation done with plain old JavaScript. Here's another page that actually caused a little bit of controversy at the time. The writer behind this wrote an article about AJAX effects, and this was from his demo page. So you would click on this, and there was that yellow transition on the number, an AJAX effect. And a lot of people yelled because just because something has a cool transition or a nice effect to it does not mean that it goes and talks to a server and comes back with other information. This is just animation being done locally, both to move the numbers and to have that yellow transition. So no AJAX here at all. And finally, this is a game which some people think must have AJAX just because it looks kind of cool and you can move things around and all. But again, it's not going and talking to a server. It is actually JavaScript. This isn't Flash, and it looks kind of Flash-like. But really it is just JavaScript. No AJAX required. So here's our terms. In order to be AJAX, it has to be JavaScript, not Flash. But it also has to contain something that goes and talks to a server and then comes back to the browser and updates somehow. What goes back and forth between the browser and the server may be XML, maybe not. It can be the browser updating the server or the server updating the browser. But there has to be communication between the two. That communication has to be asynchronous, and it all has to be done with JavaScript. And that is what we'll be talking about throughout the rest of this course. So let's get started. In AJAX Essential Training, we're going to be covering a lot of topics. Here's a quick overview. Going to start off with Developer Essentials. That's going to include the development workflow, how to choose the right tools, including text editors, browsers, servers. And I'm also going to talk about the prerequisites that I'm expecting you to know: HTML, CSS, and at least a little bit of JavaScript. The next chapter covers the DOM and XML. I'm not sure how much knowledge you're coming into this with, so I'm going to at least do an overview about the DOM and XML to get you up to speed so you understand what's going on throughout the rest of this course. Next up is XML HTTP requests. As I just talked about, the essence of AJAX is the XML HTTP request, and so we're going to do an entire chapter covering it and seeing it in action. In previewing links with AJAX, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how to do code that you can pick up and use anywhere to read in HTML files and use them to give your site and its users a little bit more information. In creating dynamic forms, you'll see how to use AJAX and a little bit of CSS and JavaScript to make your sites more dynamic and useful to your users. Dynamic maps, again, will use AJAX and JavaScript and CSS, along with your already existing HTML, to again provide your users with more information as they traverse your site. Then we'll get into AJAX frameworks. A great deal of the power of AJAX has come from the number of frameworks and libraries available for anyone to use, and so in this chapter, we'll cover some of the more popular ones and why you'd want to pick one over another. And finally, in using the UE animation widget, we're talking about the Yahoo User Interface Library and using its animation component along with a number of other parts of its library in order to add really nice effects to your website without having to do a lot of coding by yourself. One other thing I want to point out is that throughout this course, I'm not going to be reading every line of code. Primarily, I'm not going to do that because it's very boring. But in addition, instead of reading every line of code, I'll be going over each line and discussing what it's doing and the concepts behind it. So if you don't have access to the exercise files, you should still be able to pause the video and type up what you see on the screen. So now, let's get started. Before you can start developing AJAX, you need to know a little bit about, well, what you need to know. So we're going to start off with what you're going to need in terms of tools. The first thing you're going to need is a text editor. Chances are good that you probably already have one. It's what you're using to create your HTML, your CSS, your JavaScript. Next, you're going to need a browser. Again, you already have one. For the purpose of this course, I recommend Firefox for a lot of reasons that I'll go into later, but you're going to need a browser to be able to test what you're doing. And lastly, you're going to need a web server. You haven't needed a web server in the past just to test your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But now, because of what AJAX is, you're going to need a web server in order to be able to test your code before you ever actually put it live. The second part of your toolkit is what you need to know, what you should already know from previous courses or previous experience. I'm expecting that you should know HTML, that you should know CSS, and that you should know JavaScript. If you're not comfortable with any of those, check out some of our other courses, which will be happy to teach you everything that you need. I'll be going into more detail in a later movie about more precisely exactly what you need to know about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now that we're getting started on AJAX, I'm assuming that you already have a site to which you wish to add AJAX. So what kind of site do you already have? Maybe it's a static HTML site. Maybe it's a site with a little bit of JavaScript, but no AJAX code yet. Or maybe it's a site where you've got tons of stuff that's already in PHP, Ruby on Rails, Perl, whatever, but all your code's on the server side. But now you want to add some client-side fanciness to it, and you want to do that using AJAX. So I'm assuming that you're already going to have some of this stuff. First thing you got to do is make sure that what you have works. I have seen people run into nasty troubles because they think they want a JavaScript or AJAX-enabled site, and they go and create their page, and then they go and add a whole bunch of code to it, and then they wonder why all this code isn't working, and they think it's a problem with JavaScript and AJAX. When actually, if they had just tested the HTML page, the static HTML page, all by itself in the first place, they would have found out that never worked properly. So before you add anything code-wise, make sure that what you have to start off with is already working. So now we can get into the workflow. And the workflow is very similar to what you've done with previous web pages. You edit just using a text editor. You move files to the server, or maybe you're already just editing them on the server. But they need to end up on the server before you can test. And if you've been doing web pages already, you already know what the next step is, and that's do it again. So you edit, make sure your files are on the server, test, and keep doing that until you get it just the way you want it. Next up, we're going to talk about exactly what the right tools are for the job, in particular text editors. With AJAX, you're going to be spending a lot of time looking at your text editor. So if you don't already have a really good text editor, you're going to want one. So in this lesson, I want to talk some about why I use the text editor I use, how to find a good one, and what you're looking for in a text editor. If you're on a Mac, the two most popular ones that I've found are BBEdit and TextMate. I use BBEdit. You'll be seeing a lot of it. However, there are many people who just love TextMate and just can't imagine living without it. So both of them are perfectly good options. If you're on Windows, a couple of text editors that I've heard good things about and used a little bit are UltraEdit and eTextEditor. And for either platform, Mac or Windows, and Unix as well, there's also the Eclipse IDE and Komodo. That's both a Komodo Edit and Komodo IDE. And they'll work on any platform. All of these products are available just by downloading. Some of them are free, some of them are for pay, but you can get any of them online just by downloading them. Most of them you can test out if they aren't already free. And so you can make a good decision about which one works best for you. Here at barebones.com, you'll see that as of this recording, the most current version of BBEdit is 8.7. Next, TextMate is at macromates.com, and you can see the current version at this moment is 1.5.7. For those of you on Windows, you can check out UltraEdit, which right now is at version 13.20. For those still on Windows, there's the eTextEditor, which is similar to TextMate, but on Windows. So if you've been a Mac user, or you're both on Mac and Windows, and you find you really like TextMate, you might want to check out eTextEditor on Windows, because then you can use some of the same automation tools on both platforms. For both Mac and Windows, there's Komodo, which you can see here is at activestate.com/products/Komodo_IDE, and that's for IDE 4 right now. There's also Komodo Edit 4, which is the free version that has a little less functionality, but it might be all that you need. And lastly, there's Eclipse.org, which is the home of the Eclipse Open Development Platform. And in some ways, it might be overkill for what you're trying to do with just HTML, JavaScript, CSS, XML. but it is free and it is a full-featured development environment. Now I want to talk a little bit about what to look for in a text editor. Here's what I consider to be important when I'm editing and testing my code. Here I've got two files, an HTML file and a JavaScript file, and I'm going to open them in BBEdit. So now let's see a few of the things that I look for when using a text editor. So I'll select my HTML and JavaScript file and open them up. And you'll see first off that it opened them both in one window. One of the things I like about BBEdit is that it can open the documents in a single window, and then I can switch back and forth over here. But if I want them to open in separate windows, I can do that as well. Another feature, over here on the left, you'll see that there are line numbers, and this can help with debugging. For instance, if your debugger tells you that you have a problem on line 20, it's handy to be able to see immediately what's going on line 20. Another feature that you'll want in a text editor is line numbers. One of the main reasons that line numbers are handy is because a debugger will tell you, for instance, that you have a problem with line 5, and you want to be able to see at a glance what line 5 is and not have to go through and count 1, 2, 3, 4. With this, I can see that this is line 5, and I'll know immediately where the problem is. Other important features that you can see, for instance, BBEdit has syntax coloring. I can differentiate at a glance what my tags are, what my strings are, what my attributes are, and it makes it very easy to be able to figure out if there's a problem. For instance, if I've left off a quote somewhere, you can immediately see that things are just the wrong color. Another important feature is syntax coloring. The reason why this matters is because it can tell you at a glance if you have a problem. Right now you can see, for instance, that my tags are colored blue, links are colored in red, attributes are in pink, their values are in brown. If, for example, I'm missing a closing quote, you can see immediately that there's a problem because all of a sudden this href is the wrong color. And then I know that something's odd, and I can just see that because of the color, which helps me track down all kinds of issues before they actually become problems. Now, if we switch over to our JavaScript file here, and I can do that just by clicking on the script.js file, BBEdit helps you write code in a number of different ways. For instance, you can see that the word function here is in blue. That lets me know that I'm working on a function, and BBEdit just knows that certain keywords such as function, var, else, if, and so on are to be done in blue. And then I can see again at a glance that there's a problem. Another useful feature is balancing. You can see here I have the cursor just after an open brace, and I can go to the View menu and say Balance, and it will then show me where the end of that function is, where the matching brace is to that opening brace. You can see now that BBEdit has highlighted that area, so I can see exactly what is in that function and what is not. Once I have this highlighted, I can go back up to the View menu and I can say Fold the selection. Now, folding is a useful feature where the text editor just hides the code from you. It hasn't disappeared, it hasn't gone away, and you can tell right now that something is there because you've got this ellipsis, the 3 dots there. And now if I scroll up to the top, everything that isn't in that function is showing. That function is there, it's just hidden, and you know it's there and hidden, actually not just because of the dots, but also because there are missing line numbers. You can see that we skip straight from line 8 to line 31. That's because that code is folded, it's hidden. And it's a handy way to look through a whole lot of code at once, because you can hide, say, the parts of the code where you know things are fine and not have to keep jumping back and forth between 2 or 3 different areas. You can see all of it that you want to see at one time. And then when you want to see it again, you just double-click on the ellipsis and it opens up again. Another useful feature, if you have, say, a very long file, is the ability to jump back and forth between different functions. In this menu, I can see right now I'm in the Make Request function. I want to jump down to the Show Contents function. I just select it here, and boom, I've scrolled all the way down to the end and the last function. And that lets me move around quickly inside my file. These are just a few of the things that I think are important about a text editor. You may have your own list. In fact, you probably do. You're going to want to find one that helps you work in the cleanest and simplest way, that stays out of your way when you want it to and helps you when you want it to. Next up, we're going to talk about browsers, and in particular, Firefox. Here we are at the Firefox homepage. I'm sure you already have a browser, but if you haven't checked out Firefox, it's well worth checking out. One of the nice things about it is that it's cross-platform, so you're going to get the same results no matter what type of computer you're on, what type of operating system. But because it's open source, a lot of people have done add-ons that help it do a lot more than just your average browser. Now we're going to take a look at 3 add-ons that I think every web developer needs to have, especially if you're working with JavaScript and AJAX. The first tool I want to cover for Firefox you can find under the Tools menu, and it's the DOM Inspector. This comes with Firefox automatically. And with it, you can take a look at the DOM of the web page that you're currently viewing. If you're not completely comfortable with the DOM yet, I'll be going into more detail about it later, but suffice it to say that right now, it lets you view information about the page that you're currently on. And not only can you see the DOM, but you can also say that you want to see various other things about it. Box model, CSS, JavaScript, for instance. We'll be spending a lot of time looking at the DOM Inspector and the JavaScript object model here. Other useful tools, if we go back to this page, other useful tools can be found here under the Add-ons item, under the Tools menu. And you can see here, there's DOM Inspector, but if you go down to the bottom right, you can click on Get Extensions. And if you click on that, it takes you to the Firefox Add-ons page. From there, you want to click on Web Development. That's a category for extensions. From there, you want to click on Popularity, because there's a couple of very popular add-ons that you're going to want to have if you don't already. Now scroll down a little, and there's 2 that you want. One is called Firebug, and one is called Web Developer. And they're both incredibly handy for debugging problems with JavaScript, CSS, HTML, everything. So just click on it, install now. Now I go back and download the Web Developer toolbar, install now, and install it. And now these have both downloaded. Yes, it was that quick. Now all I have to do is restart Firefox, and they'll both be available to me the next time I launch Firefox. So downloading them was quick, but we're not actually going to see them until we restart Firefox. So let's do that. Click that. It says I'm going to close tabs, and that's fine. And hey, there's Firefox back again, but now with a few more options. You'll see that there's a bar across here. This is the Web Developer toolbar. You can turn it off by going to View, Toolbars, Web Developer toolbar. My personal preference, I do Customize. And then if you scroll down, you'll see a Web Developer icon. I add this to my top bar right there. And then I say Done. And then I click that, and now the Web Developer toolbar is hidden. You don't have to look at it unless you want to. It's not going to be around all the time, getting in your face. But when you want it, you just click right there, and you'll see the Web Developer toolbar again. If you spend some time looking at the Web Developer toolbar, you'll see that it actually does an amazing number of things. Here's a couple of the ones that are particularly important when you're working with AJAX. Now, I'm sure you've looked at view source before. Everybody's looked at view source. It's a great way to learn HTML in the first place. And here's view source. But more importantly, here's view generated source. Much of what you're doing with AJAX is adding elements to the web page. Adding elements, replacing, moving things around. View generated source lets you look at the web page as it is currently on the screen. And because of that, you can actually look at the code that you're seeing, and it helps you track down some of the problems with your AJAX code. That's important. Another example of a useful tool in the Web Developer toolbar is under the Outline menu. You can, for instance, outline block level elements if you're having a CSS problem. This puts lines around every block on the page, and if something is not quite where you expect it to be, this outline will show you where the browser actually thinks it is. And let's say, for instance, you have a div that isn't inside another div and you think it should be, you'll be able to see at a glance that it's somewhere else. When you want to turn it off, you have to go back into the Outline menu and uncheck it, and then it goes away again. That's true for pretty much everything in the Web Developer toolbar. But spend some time looking through all the options in the toolbar. There's actually an immense number of options there, many of which are very useful. And the third tool I want to talk about is called Firebug. And if you look down here, way down on the bottom right, there's a new little icon. It's a circle with a line through it. If you right-click on it, or control-click for you Mac users who still have a one-button mouse, you'll see that there's several options here. Right now, Firebug is disabled. So let's click that to turn Firebug on, and you'll see it's now green. If you click it again, you'll get the Firebug menu. The page is now broken up into the main web page up here, and the Firebug window down at the bottom. The Firebug menu lets you view a number of different things. Here's a console, here's the HTML, here's the CSS on the page, here's scripts, here's the document object model. Here we're back in the HTML again, but now we can, over on the right side, we're looking at style, or we can look at the layout, or we can look at the DOM. If we're looking in the scripts here, over on the right-hand side, there's a couple of really interesting options. One is watch. We can tell JavaScript itself to keep an eye on certain values, so that if we're wondering how things are getting set differently than we expect them to, Firebug will let us know when that happened and how it happened. If you've worked on other programming languages besides JavaScript, you may have gotten used to using a debugger, and you want to be able to set what's called a breakpoint. Breakpoint means that your code will run up into a certain spot, and then it will stop. And it will let you check on various values and just basically look at the code while it's running. So a breakpoint lets you get into the code and actually take a look at what's going on. And then you can start it up again by clicking one of these buttons up here. All in all, if you're working with JavaScript, Firebug is immensely useful. And then when you don't want to look at it anymore, you can just click the little close and it's gone again. So we turn off Firebug, or at least tell it to go into its corner, and we can close the Web Developer toolbar, and everything looks pretty much the way it would normally, but all of a sudden we have an immense amount of power available to us when we need it. Next, we're going to talk about web servers, both for Mac and for Windows, how to get them and how to make them run and how to use them. For those of you who are Mac users, it's really easy to set up a web server on Mac OS X. All you got to do is go into System Preferences and click a checkbox. However, we're going to make things a little bit more complex here so that we can make things a whole lot easier later. So what you're going to do in the Finder is go up to the Go menu and say Go to Folder. And we want to go to the folder /etc, which is pronounced Etsy, and then click Go. Inside that folder, you'll see another folder called Apache 2. If you're running Leopard, you'll see it at least. If you're running Tiger or an older version of OS 10, 10.4 or earlier, you're going to look instead for a folder called HTTPD. So whichever one of those two folders you find, inside there you're going to look for a file called httpd.conf, short for configuration. Now this is an important file, so the very first thing we're going to want to do is make a backup of it before we touch it at all. So to do that, you click on it, and then you right-click for those of you with a multi-button mouse, or control-click for those of you with a single-button mouse, and go down to Copy httpd.conf. Click inside the folder again and say Paste Item. It's going to ask me for my password because this is a protected directory. I'll put it in. And now we've got a backup called httpd copy.conf. So now we can go and edit the file knowing that in case there's any kind of problem, we have a backup. So just double click it, and for me it launches BB Edit. And you want to look for a line that talks about document root. So you can do find. Start at the top and find. And here's some stuff about document root. Now we want to copy this line. Copy it here. Then put in a new line. You'll see it said, hey, this is locked. Do you want to unlock it? And yes, I do want to unlock it because I want to edit it. So now we paste in the line we copied, so it's in there twice. Now we change that first line to have a pound sign or a hash mark in front of it. That tells Apache, the web server we're going to turn on, that this is a comment and it can be ignored. But we put this in there so that if somebody comes along later and wants to know what it used to be, now they know. But we're going to change what document root points to make life simpler. Instead of going to library web server documents, we're going to tell it to go to users/Dory/sites. You, of course, would put in whatever your username is. So unless your name is Dory, your line isn't going to look like mine. And this is case sensitive, so you're going to want the U in users to be uppercase and the S in sites to be uppercase, but your username is all lowercase. And so then we save this file. And because, again, it was locked and in a protected directory, I'm going to have to put in my password again. And now we've saved out the file. So we close it. Now we can close this Finder window because we're done with it. So go up to the Apple menu and go to System Preferences, and we're going to look for Sharing under Internet and Network. Click it. And right now it's locked, so I need to unlock anything to make changes here as well. So now I've unlocked it. What we care about is the service called web sharing. In previous versions of OS X, it's called personal web sharing. But all we want to do is click it, click that checkbox, and now web sharing is on. That's all there is to starting up Apache on your computer. We started off with this locked, so we want to end up with it locked again. So we just click the lock, and now we close System Preferences. Now we want to see if we got it right, because we just want to test it. So we do that by launching Firefox, and then in the address bar, we type in localhost, just by itself. And this is the default web page for a user, which is what we've told localhost to load, versus the default page for the Mac itself. So just to make sure that that's the case, let's go look at it in the Finder. So we switch over to the Finder. That's me. We go to Sites. Here's the index.html page that we want to be sure we have. Double click and yep, that's the same one. So we got it right. One thing to keep in mind, if you're using a Mac that's used by a number of people, you're going to want to reset httpd.conf back to the way it was beforehand, because otherwise every time they go to localhost, when they're logged in as their user, they're going to try and run it out of your directory. And that's probably not what you want. But at least for your own testing, or if this is your personal machine, you can just leave it that way. Now that we know that the web browser is going where it should, we want to do one last bit of setup. So close these Firefox windows. And in the Sites folder, we want to create a new folder. And we're going to call it AJAX. And that's where we're going to keep our files to do our testing. And that way we don't have to keep moving files around from folder to folder and wonder where the last version is. Instead, we're just going to put everything in this AJAX folder, and then we can test it in the same folder where we're doing editing. So here's our exercise files. And what we want to do is select everything, chapters 1 through 9, right-click or control-click, copy these items, and then go back here to the AJAX folder we just created, and paste items. And there we are, and all our files from now on, for the rest of the exercises throughout this course, will be in the AJAX folder inside the Sites folder, inside your local user directory. Next up, just enough HTML and CSS. This lesson is for those of you who are Windows users. In this lesson, we're going to go over downloading and installing an Apache server and setting it up so that we can do all our AJAX testing from now on. In Firefox, I've gone to wampserver.com, where you'll be able to download a single file that you'll be able to open up and install Apache, PHP, MySQL. For this course, we only care about Apache, but it's not a bad idea to have PHP and MySQL around as well. So this is a French site, so we're going to go to the English version. And then I need to go to Downloads. So I want to download the latest release of WAMP Server 2, and I'll do that here. And it's going to start downloading. Now I want to save this file. And I'm doing it to the desktop. So now I run this, and I don't have it currently installed, so I can just install it. And I'm just following along with the WAMP Server 2 setup wizard. I'm going to accept the agreement. It's going to put itself in a WAMP folder in C, and that's fine. We can make a quick launch icon or desktop icon, either one, your choice. And that's all it needs to know. We're going to install. And you can see all kinds of stuff is now being installed. SQLite Manager, PHP, admin stuff. Here's Apache. And I'm recommending this because it's a nice one-step process. However, if you're already running any type of web server, that's fine as well. It's asking if I want to use Firefox as the default browser. Sure. So any type of web server is fine. In this case, I want to be localhost. For email, I don't care because we're not going to be doing anything with AJAX and email. Do I want to launch it now? Sure. And so now we've got a little icon here. And now it's come up. And so I'm going to go and check out localhost. And here's our WAMP server. So now I want to go back to my computer, go to my C drive, and I can see now there's a folder called WAMP. I want to open that up, and inside there will be a folder called www. Open that up, and I want to create a new folder here called AJAX. So there's our AJAX folder. Now I'm going to open up the exercise files folder, and I'm going to take everything here, and I'm going to copy it into AJAX. So I open up AJAX, and now it's all there. So here we are at the page showing our server configuration, and then we can go to AJAX/ chapter 08 slash 01 slash script.html. And now we see that it looks like everything installed correctly and we're able to run one of our test files. So now back on with AJAX. In this lesson, I want to talk about the prerequisites for AJAX, what I'm expecting that you already know. For those of you following along with the exercise files, I'm looking at localhost AJAX chapter 01/06/script.html. There's nothing particularly fancy about this page, so let's go take a look at the code. I've switched over to my text editor, and now I'm looking at the HTML page. This is really pretty simple and straightforward HTML. There's a head, there's a body. Inside the head, we've got a link to a style sheet that's in the same directory, and we've got a link via a script tag to a script.js file, also inside the same directory. The body of the page is a table, and down at the end there's a paragraph containing a link. Many of the table cells have an ID attribute, which are set to square 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and so on. This is all stuff that you should be very familiar with in terms of HTML. If you're not, you probably want to go check out one of our HTML titles. Now we're going to switch over to script.css, and in a similar fashion, this is straightforward cascading style sheet. There's some simple rules for the body, for the h1 tag, for the th, table headers, for the table itself. We're setting some alignment. This is all straightforward CSS that you'll be expected to already know for the rest of this title. Onto the JavaScript. This is the script.js file. And again, this is JavaScript that you'll be expected to know for the rest of this title. At top, there is a window.onload handler. That's going to take control when the page first loads. We're setting up a variable called usenums, and it's going to be an array. Here's a function called newCard. Here's a for loop that's going to go around 24 times, calling another function called setSquare and passing it a value of I. Here is an if-else conditional. These are all things that you should know by now and should be very comfortable with. Scrolling down some, here's the setSquare function with a value being passed to it. A number of other variables being created and initialized. A string, an array, here's a number. Here's another type of conditional. This one's a do while. This one's going to do something while some value is true. And at the end of this function, we're going to use something that you should be very familiar with, or will be shortly, document.getElementById. That's passed a value. That's the name of an ID. And once we get that, we're going to use its inner HTML and set it to a value which will change how things appear on the screen. And here's our final function, getNewNum, which returns a value. This is all JavaScript that should be familiar to you now. If it isn't, you probably want to go check out our JavaScript title and come back to this when all of this looks more familiar. Next up, we're going to start into understanding the DOM and XML. In this lesson, I'm going to be talking about the document object model, an important part of understanding AJAX. What you need to keep in mind is that everything in a document, everything in the browser window, is an object. And when we talk about these objects, the word for that is model. So when we talk about objects on a web page, that is the DOM. So here's a web page, one we've seen before. This H1 is itself an object on the web page. This table is an object on a web page. This title is an object on a web page. And in fact, the page itself is an object called document. Now, objects have something called properties. So here you can see that the document object has a title property. And yes, we saw that title was an object of its own. Properties are themselves objects in their own right. Similarly, this link is also a property of the document object. And this table that we've seen before as an object is also a property of the document object. And each row is a property of the table object. And going on down the line, each cell is a property of the row object. At this point, you're probably wondering, how do you keep all these things straight when there are so many objects on a page? Well, thankfully, Firefox is really good at helping you do that. And because the DOM is such an important part of JavaScript and AJAX, and manipulating the DOM and examining the DOM is a lot of what we're going to be doing, so we'll be covering that in our next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at how Firefox and its DOM inspector help you learn more about the DOM and keep track of what's going on behind the scenes. If you're following along, we're looking at localhost AJAX chapter 02/02/script.html, and we go to Tools, and we pull down to DOM Inspector, which will bring up the DOM Inspector for this web page. When the DOM Inspector first comes up, you'll see that on the left-hand side it's got Document DOM Nodes, and on the right-hand side it's got Object DOM Node. So it's taking a look at the document, and then for any given object in that document, it'll tell us something about it. So what we do is we click over here on the left and take a look at the various objects. This is the entire HTML page itself. Open that up. You can see it's got a head and a body. If we open up the body, you can see there's an H1, a table, and a paragraph. Open the paragraph, and here's our link at the bottom. One of the nice features about the Firefox DOM Inspector is if, for instance, you click here on the P, you'll notice over here that the paragraph itself flashes several times so that you can see precisely where it is you're looking at. So if you want to know where things are in the syntax that I used earlier, you can follow along here. Every time it goes down one level, it's the equivalent of that dot I was using before, which is what JavaScript uses. So you've got document and the table. You've got the table and its rows. Here's rows, and here's the cells in the row. Now, if we want to know a little bit more about it, we can go over here and change from looking at the DOM node to the pull down and take a look at the JavaScript object. This will tell us more about the cell that we've selected on the left. And here's our subject. It's an HTML table cell element. If we open this up, we'll be able to see all kinds of things. For instance, node name is a TD. That's because it's a table cell. The current value of it inside the inner HTML is the number 13. And you can scroll down and see all kinds of things. For instance, it has an alignment of left, vertical alignment of middle. But the most important thing that you're going to care about is here, where it has an ID of square 0. And you can also see that here as part of the DOM. That's how you're going to be referring to it within your JavaScript code. You'll probably want to spend some time looking around through this because there's a great deal of information here that you'll be able to see once you start needing to find your way around. Another good example of what you could do with this is this pull down here. You can do things like, say, find nodes. Let's say I have a node, which I know I have, with an ID of square 20. So I can put this in. Let's say I have no idea where on the screen this might be or where in the DOM it might be. And I say find, and it opened up this row, it opened up this cell, took me right there. If you notice, it flashed over on the screen to show me which one it was, and then it put the JavaScript object over on the right so that I can go and examine it. So that lets me know not just where it is on the page, but where it is in the DOM as well, just by doing a find. Now that we know something about the DOM, we're going to see how to use JavaScript to examine and manipulate the DOM. In this lesson, we're going to see not just how JavaScript can manipulate the DOM, but how you can use Firefox and the DOM inspector to see what's going on behind the scenes. If you're following along with the examples, this is localhost AJAX chapter 02/03 script.html, and it's a pretty straightforward, simple little page to all appearances. So let's take a look at what's actually going on in the HTML and JavaScript. So I switch to my text editor, go to the HTML file. Here's our simple web page. It has a form. Inside the form is a text area with an ID of text area, an input button. After the form, there's a paragraph of text telling us what to do. But mostly there's a script called script.js that's doing all the work here. So let's go take a look at it. When the document loads, that triggers the window.onload event handler, which is going to call the initAll function. InitAll just says anytime we do a submit on the form, we're going to call the addNode function. And everything else here is in addNode. What addNode does is it calls getElementById, passes it a value of text area. If you recall, that was our text area name, the ID for that text area, and then it gets its value. So whatever was entered in there when we hit submit ends up in the variable inText. Next, we call document.createTextNode and pass it whatever got entered. That creates a brand new text node and puts it in the variable newText. Next, we create a new paragraph. Document.createElement is passed a p. That gives us a new p tag. That's put in the variable newGraph. And then we call newGraph.appendChild. That takes the text node that we created and puts it into our new paragraph tag. So we've got this new paragraph tag with our text in it. What we do is we look at document.getElementsByTagName and pass it body. Unless there's a real problem with our page, there should only be one body tag, and sub0 gets the first one. That's stored in the variable docBody. And then we take our body tag and we append a child to that, which is our new paragraph. So at the very end of the body, we put a new paragraph containing whatever text we entered. And finally, we would do a return false so that the form doesn't actually get submitted, because we don't actually need to go to a new page. Everything's being handled here. So now that we know what this is supposed to do, let's go back to Firefox and see what's going on. We type something in here, hit submit, and some text will get entered on the page. But we want to actually see what's going on behind the scenes. So we're going to go up to the DOM inspector. I'm going to open this up bigger. In the DOM inspector, I'm going to click Inspect. What this does is it gives me my little web page here at the bottom, and then up on top I can see what's actually going on. So here's our various fields. Now I'll say our new paragraph is ready to be entered. So I'll say paragraph 1 and submit. And you can see paragraph 1 was there, but all of a sudden now there's a new paragraph here that wasn't there before. And if we look at it in the DOM node inspector there's paragraph 1, and there's our P. We can enter another one and say submit, and you can see there's our new paragraph, which has a value of paragraph 2, as it says over here. So using the DOM inspector, we can see precisely what's going on while things are running and after things have been added. This is going to be very helpful behind the scenes to figure out what AJAX is doing when it's not doing exactly what we want it to be doing. Next up, we're going to take a look at XML. In the previous lessons, we've talked a lot about HTML and CSS and JavaScript And now we're finally getting to the one last big piece of AJAX, which is XML. XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. But what it is at its core is a way of showing data in a text format that's parsable by scripting languages, but also one that people can look at. It's not put together in some binary format that only computers can use. Actual people can look at this and understand it. So let's look at some. This is an XML file. For those of you following along with the files, this is in the AJAX folder, chapter 02/04/us-states.xml. Just an XML file opened up in a text editor. Starts off with a tag called choices, and we're saying it's XML and it's an English language. And there are 50 items in here, as you might guess. Each one has a label, which is a state name, and a value, which is its 2-character code. So we have item, label, value, item, label, value, item, label, value, and so on, all the way down to Wyoming. This file happens to be in alphabetical order by state name. And this is all there is to a simple XML file. So all we have to do is load this in. So let's see how it looks in Firefox. And the nice thing is, Firefox doesn't actually just dump it out on the screen or refuse to open it up. What it says is, hey, this is an XML file. You didn't give me any style information about it. So I'm just going to show you what I can show you, which it refers to as the document tree. So you see the same things below that we saw in the text editor. But now we have a little bit more functionality, interestingly enough. For instance, where we had an item Alabama, we can now click on the minus and close it up. Now it's a plus. Open it up again by clicking on the plus. So we can fold things up if we want to. Just make sure things balance out the way we'd expect them to. Or I can close up the entire file and we can see that it's begin and end choices. But that's not the only thing that Firefox can do with an XML file. So once again, we're going to go into the DOM inspector. And we can see here that, again, it thinks it's a document. And it thinks it's a document because it actually is a document. When we're talking about the document object model, we're not only talking about things on a web page. We're talking about things in any kind of document. XML, just another kind of document. It's in a form that a browser can parse and that scripting languages can parse and understand. And so when we want to go in and look at this XML file via JavaScript, we can do that because we can see that it has become a JavaScript object. You can see, for instance, that this JavaScript object has a local name of value. Let's go and see what the value is. And we open it up. And this value has data of AL. Because it's XML, JavaScript can get at it. Because it's XML, it actually has an object model. And then because we have XML and JavaScript together, we can do the same things with XML that we've been doing with a regular web page. For instance, we can do getElementById because JavaScript knows how to get things with an ID, and because the XML is in the object model, we can use tags and IDs to retrieve information out of it. So we don't have to go looking through every single possible item. We just say, get this particular ID and get that value. This is an important concept in understanding why browsers and AJAX use XML as their way of getting data. Now that we know more about XML and why we want to use XML, we're going to start looking at XML HTTP requests and how JavaScript requests that XML and what it does with it once it has it. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the basics of HTTP requests, because in order to understand what an XML HTTP request is, we need to be clear that we understand what an HTTP request by itself is. Every time a browser asks for a page, it's an HTTP request. So here on the screen, you'll see a computer. It's about to look at a web page. So let's say we've got Firefox, and we want to load in google.com. So our computer and our browser sends a message to a web server and say, I want that address. The server grabs the index page, and then the server sends the index page back to your browser. Your browser starts to render that page, and it finds a tag containing a reference to an image. So the browser knows that it needs to go and request that image. So that's a whole nother HTTP request. So now we ask again for the image. The server looks for the image, sends the image back to our browser, and the browser finishes rendering the page and then displays it on our screen. This is what happens for every web page. If there's 10 different graphics, it does the HTML page plus the 10 graphics. Looking at a CSS file is an HTTP request. Getting a JavaScript file is an HTTP request. This is all things that your browser's always done. How this all relates to JavaScript and AJAX and XML HTTP requests will be in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to take a good look at the XML HTTP request, which is the core functionality of AJAX. One of the first things to learn is how it's spelled and capitalized. Your first guess would be that XML and HTTP would all be in uppercase, but you'd be right on one and wrong on the other. XML is capitalized. In HTTP, only the H is capitalized, and in request, only the R is capitalized. The reason this matters is because JavaScript is case sensitive, and if you get any of those characters wrong, JavaScript will get very confused. So after you've typed it a few times, you'll get used to which characters are and are not uppercase. Now, the XML HTTP request itself. It's JavaScript, so it's an object. Objects, as we know, contain properties. Here's the ones that XML HTTP request has. And we'll be covering these in much more detail over the next few lessons. Properties are ready state, response text, response XML, status, and status text. There's also an event handler called onReadyStateChange. The ready state property has several different statuses. When it has a value of 0, that's when you start off. It starts off uninitialized, object contains no data, there's nothing there. When it's a 1, that means that your request is loading. Things are going on, it's in progress. When it has a value of 2, your request has finished loading. When it has a value of 3, the official name for it is interactive, which means that the user can interact with the XML HTTP request object, although it isn't fully loaded, so I wouldn't really recommend it. And lastly, the value 4, which is complete. This is the one that you're going to be checking for almost every time, because in general, you're not going to want to take a look at the request until it's done initializing. Next off, there's status. As with any HTTP request, you're going to have a status. Generally, what you're going to want is a value of 200, which just means, okay, everything worked great. Other possible statuses are 400 for bad request, 401 for unauthorized, 403 for forbidden, and the good old 404 not found, which I'm sure you've seen while browsing the web. And finally, 500 internal server error. For the most part, the values that you're going to care about are either 200, which is okay, or not 200, which means that you have a problem. As with any good JavaScript object, XML HTTP request has methods. And again, we'll be looking at these in much more depth over the next few lessons. There's abort, which says abort the request. Get all response headers, which asks the server for the response headers. Get response header, in which you pass a certain particular header name and get a response. The open method, which can be passed several different parameters. There's method, URL, an async flag, which is true or false, and the optional username and password. The most common example that we'll be seeing a lot of is an open, passing it a get, then passing it a URL, which is going to be something like myfile.xml, and then passing it a value of true. The async flag can be true or false. Asynchronous is true, which means that everything is going on without your code having direct control over it. If we set async to be false, then the request is what's called synchronous, which means your code is going to sit and wait for anything to come back from the server. The real value of XML HTTP request is in the way it is asynchronous. So you're almost always going to want to do an asynchronous request because you want things to be going on in the background without your code having to sit and wait for things to happen. Another method is send and some content. This actually sends the request to the server. And finally, set request header, which passes a label and a value to the server, which sets a specific header on the request that we're sending to the server. Next, we're going to get to see XML HTTP request in action and actually look at some code. In this lesson, we'll look at how XML HTTP request actually works in the code from both the standards compliant viewpoint and the old Microsoft IE6 viewpoint, and the different states that the request can be in at different times and how that drives your code. If you're following along with the files, this is Chapter 303 script.html. For the first few examples, we're just going to be looking at the code instead of typing it in, just so we can develop an understanding of what's going on. And this is a very bare bones HTML page, but you can see that it links to a JavaScript file called script.js. We're going to be working with a file called colors.xml, and this colors.xml file simply contains a list of names and their hex values. Here's where the work is actually done in script.js. When the document's first loaded, window.onload is called, and that is set in this first line to call the makeRequest function. The one other thing we want to do when the script first loads is create a new variable. This variable is called XHR, and we're setting it to be false to start off. It's a global variable. It's going to be available everywhere. So the very first thing we have is the makeRequest function, because that's called when the page first loads. Scroll down a little bit. Here's our makeRequest function. What it's going to do is it says, if window.xml HTTP request exists. This is, does this browser know about this thing called XML HTTP request? If it does, we're going to make a new XML HTTP request object and use that same variable we had before called XHR. So from this point on, instead of referring to XML HTTP request, we can just say XHR. However, if the browser doesn't know about window.xhr, we need to check one more thing. Does this browser know about window.ActiveX What this is really saying is this browser Microsoft IE6? IE7 understands window.xml HTTP request. Firefox understands window.xml HTTP request. Safari does as well, but IE6 did not. IE6 needs to know if the window.ActiveX object exists. If it does, then we want to do something called try. Try is a simple way of saying, try this, and if it fails, it's going to look for something called catch. So in IE6, we're going to try and set XHR to be a new ActiveX object, and we're passing it a value of Microsoft.xml HTTP. If the web surfer is running IE6, this will create a new ActiveX object that is an XML HTTP request object. If there's a problem, say for instance, somebody has turned off ActiveX, they'll end up in this catch and XHR will not be set. So the very next thing we need to do is say if XHR. If we manage to set it here, or we were able to set it here, then XHR will be an XML HTTP request object. And so we can continue on that. If it worked, we're going to set onReadyStateChange to be showState. What this means is that anytime the state changes of this request, so it goes from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, we want to call the showState function, and that's down below. So we're saying whenever this happens, this is what we want to do. Then we open up our request. We want to do a get. So here's our open. Then we want to do a get. We want to call a file colors.xml, and we pass it true because we want to do an asynchronous call. We want stuff to happen without us having to sit and wait for it. And finally, for here, we do xhr.send, and that actually sends the request. So we open the request and then we send the request. and this sets the request in motion to the server. If we weren't able to properly set up an XHR object, we'll end up in this else. And what that does is it resets the update area, which was the area where we're setting messages in the initial HTML file, to be, sorry, but I couldn't create an XML HTTP request. And that's all there is to make request. A lot of stuff going on there, but you'll be seeing a lot of this same stuff over and over and over again throughout the entire rest of this course. Finally, there is our show state function, because we want to see the state whenever it changes. So down here in show state, we're going to set a variable. Current message is whatever is currently in the update area. We don't want to overwrite what's currently there. So first we need to grab what's currently there. Now we're going to reset it, but we're going to start off with whatever was currently there in cur message, and then we're going to add on to it. We're going to say the current state is xhr.readystate, and the status is xhr.status. So we'll see that xhr.readystate is changing because this is the function that gets called anytime readystate changes. Let's see how it works. We need to go back to script.html, and then we'll load this file into our browser. So here we are in Firefox. We're looking at localhost AJAX chapter 03/03/script.html. And you can see this changed pretty quickly. It started off with current state is 2, status is 200, then it's 3, then it's 4. Our final state of 4 with status of 200 means that everything loaded in properly, and status of 200 is okay. Next up, we want to see what actually happens to that request. What's actually the contents of it, because that's what we're going to want to do stuff with. That's in the next lesson. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about the actual content of the XML HTTP request and how we're getting actual useful stuff back from the server from our request. If you're following along with the exercise files, this is AJAX/chapter 03/04/script.html, and it's identical to the HTML file from the previous example. The XML file is also identical. Where the changes are is just a few lines in our JavaScript code. Down at line 18, the onReadyState change event handler is triggered and will call a showContents function whenever the state is changed by the server. The showContents function down at the end now does a few checks at the beginning. We're going to check to see if xhr.readystate is 4. While the ready state can be 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, we only care about that time when it's 4, when the request is finished being served up by the web server. This function will be called every time ready state changes, as it goes from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, so on. But the only time we need to actually do anything with it is when ready state is 4. Our next line checks to see if xhr.status is 200. So we want to know, did it come back from the server with a value of OK? So if we get to the next line, it means that our ready state is 4, so it's completed the loading, and our status is 200, which means that we found the file and we were able to read it and everything. So in this case, what we're going to do is set a new variable, outMessage, to be xhr.responseText. Response text is a text that the web server passes back in response to our request from the server. So JavaScript is saying, in this case, please give me a file called colors.xml. If we get to this line of code, it means we found that file, everything was good, now we want to see what the server handed us back. Otherwise, we want to say that there was a problem with the request and take a look at the status. Is the problem that it was a 404, that it couldn't find the file? Is the problem that the file is somehow locked or we don't have permission? This way, outMessage will be set in a fashion that it will tell us what's going on. And then finally, we set the update area div in our HTML. We set its inner HTML to be whatever we've set up outMessage to be. So now that we've walked through the code, let's see what it's actually doing. We go back to our script.html file, and then we load this page into our browser. And you can see Firefox now has localhost/ajax/chapter 03/04/script.html. And this is not a particularly pretty page, but you can see that it has gone out and gotten that information from the server. and it's dumped it on the page. And now we can actually start doing something with it using JavaScript to make it more interesting, more attractive, more useful. Now it's gone out and gotten the data from the XML file on the server, and it's dumped it to the screen. It's not terribly pretty, but in coming lessons, we'll start looking at how to have JavaScript do something about that. Now, if we go back to our text editor, you may have seen down near the end here where we set out message to be response text. And you also might be remembering that there was also a property called response XML. And why didn't we use that instead? Why look at text? In our next lesson, we'll be comparing the differences between response text and response XML and seeing when you'd want to use one over the other and why. Previously, we've talked about how the XML HTTP request object returns both text and XML versions of the data being requested. Sometimes you'll want to use one and sometimes the other. And in this exercise, we're going to get into why you'd want to use one over the other. If you're following along with the exercise files, this is AJAX/chapter03/05/script.html. And in our HTML file, it's the same as before, except we've added 2 lines here, which is 2 links, one of which will request an XML file as XML, and one of which will request an XML file as text. Our colors.xml file hasn't changed any, so the bulk of the work is being done by script.js. We've changed a few things here from the previous exercise. Now, when the window loads, the initAll function will be called. Here's initAll, and what that does is set on-click handlers for our 2 links. For the first one, we're going to set document.getElementById request text. We're going to set its on-click event handler to be an anonymous function. Because event handlers can only handle a single line, an anonymous function tells JavaScript to just pretend that everything inside it is a single line of code. It's just a block that's a black box being passed off to the event handler. We're going to do 3 things inside this function. We're going to be setting the text request Boolean to be true because they requested the text version. Then we're going to call the makeRequest function. And finally, we're going to return false. We need to end up here with a return false so that JavaScript can tell the browser that the link that the user clicked on has been handled sufficiently by JavaScript. The browser does not actually need to go off to a new page, does not need to reload the current page, anything like that. JavaScript handled it all just fine. Now the on-click handler for document.getElementById request XML looks very similar. The only actual difference is that now we're setting text request to be false because if we made it here, we don't want a text request, we want an XML request. Again, we call makeRequest and we return false. So that's initAll. The makeRequest function is identical to that in the previous example. All our remaining changes are going to be down in function show contents. We're still checking to see if ready state is 4, because as always that means that we sent off a request to the server and it came back completed. Our status is 200 because it was a good request. Now we're going to set out message. And this is a shorthand if-else statement. If you're not familiar with this, you might want to take a good look at it. All it's saying is if text request, then set out message to be xhr.responseText, else set out message to be xhr.responseXML. In either case, we're just setting the out message variable, but if text request is true, we do whatever is between the question mark and the colon. If text request is false, we set out message to be whatever is after the colon up to the semicolon. So it's either response text or response XML, based on which link the user clicked on. Our else statement is the same as previously, it tells us what the error is. And finally, we set up update area inner HTML to be whatever our out message is. So let's actually see how it works. I'm going to go back to my script.html file, launch it in the browser, and we see our 2 links here. But instead of just running it here, I'm going to go run it inside the DOM inspector, because that lets me get a better look as to what's going on. I click on Inspect, and this way I can see precisely what's happening. So when I click Request an XML file as XML, we get an object XML document here. And when I look at what's contained in the HTML, I can see there's a div and there's some text, and it's just an object XML document. If I look at the actual JavaScript object, it's just text of, again, type object XML document. But the interesting thing is it has no child nodes. It is just this text here and nothing else. However, if we request an XML file as text, if we're looking at the text content versus the XML content, it's quite different. We go back up here and we take a look at the div, and instead of text, there's now something called colors. We open it and there's a whole lot of colors there. Now if we take a look at this div as the JavaScript object, you'll see its child nodes has 3. Some text, an HTML unknown element, and more text. If we open up the unknown one, we see that it's called colors, and we see that there are 55 different nodes here. So you can see there's colors, each of which has a name and a value. And they're both text. There's one value and one name. And we can go back to the DOM node viewer, and we can see here's a color, the name, and its value is aqua. Here's value, and it's set to 00FFFF. Because this is in this kind of format, div, colors, color, name, text, value, and text, we can use getElementByTagName and getElementByID to take a look at this, because these are now objects on our page. They've become nodes in the DOM tree. So even though requesting an XML file as XML might seem like what you want to be doing most of the time, you're actually going to find throughout these exercises that we almost always request an XML file as text, because we want to then be able to access the content of the request via the DOM. This way we can read it in, manipulate it, add to it, change it, display part of it, display all of it. Whatever it is we want to do, we can manipulate it via JavaScript and the DOM. Next up, we're going to talk about XML HTTP request and its security limitations, and why you can't do quite everything you want to do, but you can still do quite a bit. When you first start using AJAX, you'll find yourself thinking, boy, I can get this XML file from this server and that XML file from another server, and I can mash them all up and do all kinds of cool things. And you'll quickly find out that there are limitations on what you can do with AJAX and XML HTTP request. For instance, if you're running your own script.js file off your server, and then you do an XML HTTP request back to your server, that's fine, no problem, it's great. However, if you go and your script.js file tries to go and do an XML HTTP request off of some other web server at some other domain, what you'll find is that this isn't allowed by your browser. JavaScript keeps this from happening because otherwise, if you think about it, it can be a pretty nasty security risk. There is a workaround, which is your script.js file does an XML HTTP request back to your own web server at your domain, and then your web server is running something called a proxy. And that proxy, on your behalf, goes and asks for that file from the web server at some other domain. Now, servers can talk to servers without too much trouble, and so then the proxy gets it from the other server, and then the proxy passes it back to you. Because this is a server-side technology, however, this is outside the scope of this course. You'll want to check out one of our other titles, such as one on PHP or Ruby on Rails. Next up, we're going to get into the details of writing AJAX code. In this chapter, we're going to start getting into really adding AJAX code to improve your static HTML web pages. And here's an example of a static HTML web page. It might look at first glance like it's fairly useful, but when you really read what it says, you'll see that you know that there's 4 articles about JavaScript, but you have no idea what each one of those pages contains. And if you remember at one point that you read something good here, you'll come back and not know which link to click. There's a simple answer to that, and the answer is AJAX. What we want to do is add enough AJAX code to this page so that people coming to it can tell at a glance what they'll get when they click on the link. Another goal is to make it so that as we add more articles, we don't have to go in and add more code. We don't want any article-specific code in here. We want to make it as generic as possible because that way it's a whole lot less upkeep and it's more likely to actually be useful. And the third goal is to make it so that as people come to the page who for one reason or another do not have JavaScript, they don't have a problem finding the content. They'll still be able to see everything, get to everything. It'll just be a matter of if you do have JavaScript and a current browser, you'll get more functionality. You're not actually going to hurt people with other browsers. So what is it we're going to do? Let's take a look. As we scroll over a link, we see a little pop-up. This pop-up contains a mini preview of the actual content of the web page itself. And as we go over each of the other links, you'll see that it changes. And it's just the beginning of each of the web pages that we would see as we clicked on them. So how do we do this? Let's take a look in further lessons. In this lesson, we're going to see how adding just a little bit of HTML and CSS is going to work towards making our pages smarter with AJAX. For those of you following along with the exercises, I'm looking at AJAX/chapter04/02/script.html. And given that we already have our static HTML and CSS files, I'm only going to have to add one small thing to HTML. And I'm going to do that at line 14, just above the body tag. All I want to do is add a new div with an ID of preview win. And that's just going to be our little preview window that shows up that you saw in the last lesson. And then our end div, and then put a space in there so that there is something inside the div, because otherwise some browsers have problems with it. And that's all we need to add to the HTML. Save that. Then we go into our CSS file, and in our CSS file we need to actually add the style rules that will handle that preview window. Thankfully, that's pretty straightforward. Because we created preview window with an ID of preview win, that's all we have to modify here. Preview win, begin and end braces. We're going to give it a background color, as you saw, of kind of a pale yellow, so it looks kind of sticky note-like. In this case, we want it to have a width of 150 pixels. Let's say a height of 200 pixels. It needs to be a font. We want it to be like a little tiny font because it's just a little tiny preview. So let's make it 60% of an M. Arial, Helvetica, and any other sans serif. Needs to be some padding so that it's not right up against stuff. It needs to be positioned absolutely so that we can tell it exactly where we want to be, because it's where it pops up differs based on, for instance, which link we went over. We're not doing a separate little window for every possible link. We're just doing one that will move to different places. And because of that, we need to position this div absolutely. Now we also want to make it visibility hidden. We don't want this to show up until we tell it to show up. We're going to give it a tiny border of a darker color to set it off. And finally, we're going to tell it to say overflow hidden. There's going to be a lot more text being read in from each of these pages than we actually want to display. So anything that doesn't fit in that tiny page, we're not going to worry about it. Just hide it. And finally, to work around some possible problems, we're going to set the H1 and the H2s inside our preview window. To be another font size, because otherwise they would end up being their normal heading size, and that would take up the entire preview window. So we're going to force them to be a little bit smaller. And because we've done the H1 and the H2 after preview win, that will not affect our normal H1 and H2 on the web page. It will only affect the H1 and H2s inside preview win. So now we save this, and go back to our HTML page, and we go to preview it in the browser, and you'll see that right now, really nothing has changed. It's still a static web page. Nothing interesting has happened yet because we haven't added any AJAX. We'll do that in our next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to add some AJAX code to our page to make our links smarter and more useful. We're going to start off in our HTML page by adding a script tag because this page is going to need to bring in some JavaScript in order to use JavaScript. So that should be straightforward by now. Script source equals script.js. The type is text/JavaScript, and then we want to end our script tag. And that is the entire change that needs to be made to our HTML page at this point, or at any point. Our CSS file is fine. We updated everything in the previous lesson that needs to happen to the CSS file. Now we need to create a blank script.js file to contain all the code we're about to write. If you're following along with the exercise files, we're looking at AJAX/chapter 04/03. And if you also have access to the exercise files, you'll see that there's a folder inside chapter 04 called code snippets. We're going to grab a couple of code snippets out of there pretty soon. You'll want to do that so you don't have to type it all yourself. But first off, we'll do our usual onload. Window.onload equals init all. We need to create our XHR variable globally because we're going to want to use it in several different functions. And then because we need to know where to put up our little preview window in several functions, we're going to create an x and y pos pair of coordinates. Var x pos y pos. And that creates our coordinates that we can now use later globally. Here's our init all function. We want to look for all links. We need a list of all the links in this document. And that's simple to do. You say all links equals document.get elements by tag name. And you want every A. That gives you everything. That's an array. We now want to loop through this array. We're going to loop on I, so long as I is less than all links dot length. This should be pretty familiar to you. If not, you want to go back and review some of the JavaScript course. We now want to increment I, so we'll go through once each time. There's our loop. Inside there we want to set all links sub I dot on mouse over equal to show preview. So now we're going to need to add the show preview function. Here's the show preview function. And because it is called based on an event, and we're going to need to know details about that event, it's being passed a parameter even though you don't see it necessarily. You didn't see it up here. It's automatically passed that event. Here's that. And we want to start off by saying if we know something about the event variable it just got passed in. If it's null, then we're going to do some things. If we're finding it, we're going to do other things. So if event, we're going to create the URL variable. The URL variable will be set to evt.target. What this does is it says, you moved over a link. What was the target of that link? If we go back to our HTML page and look at it, you'll see that the target of each link is the URL of the article. So that we don't have to write a whole new script every single time, we're just going to take the destination of that link, grab it from the event, and use it as the URL we want to read in via AJAX. If the event handler wasn't passed in that way, which is true of certain browsers, we have an alternate plan, which is we just set evt equal to window.event, which will contain the information we need now, and then we set var URL equal to evt.sourceElement. And that's again where our URL came from. The other thing we need to do is set our x and y coordinates. So xpos equals event.clientX and ypos equals event.clientY. And that is everything we're going to need to do in terms of setting up our X and Y coordinates and our URL. There's one more piece we want to add here, and that is the actual AJAX functionality itself. We don't want to have to type in that same bunch of code over and over again, so I'm going to go grab it from the code snippets folder in Chapter 4. And if you have access to the exercise files, you should also. I'm going back to look at my files, and here in the code snippets folder is AJAX request.txt. I'm going to open that up, and there's some comments at the top about what you're going to want to do with it. But in this case, we know all we're going to want to do with it is just drop it in. So I'll copy it, go back to my .js file, and paste it in here. Clean it up a little. What we're doing, for those of you who don't have access to the exercise files, we're saying if this browser has window.xml HTTP request, we've already created the new XHR variable. Now we're going to assign a value to it. The value we're going to assign is that of a new XML HTTP request object. Otherwise, if we're in IE6, we want to check and see if there's a window.ActiveX object. If there is, we're going to try and create a new ActiveX object of the type Microsoft.xml HTTP. And if there isn't, there'll be an error here. So we come down here. If XHR, that means we successfully created this. Then we want to set onReady state change to the show contents function. That means anytime our ready state changes, we want to call show contents. We open up our request. We're going to want to do a get. We already have the URL set, and we pass a value of true because we want this to be asynchronous. And then finally, we send off the request. That's going to go talk to our server. If it didn't work, we throw up an alert saying, sorry, I couldn't create an XML HTTP request. So the one last bit of code we need to add here, as you might have guessed by now, is our function show contents. And again, we can go out to our snippets folder and open up AJAX response.txt. We've done the request, now we need to do the response. Here's the code we want. Copy it, move back to our JS file, and paste it in. What this code does is it checks to see if the ready state is 4. Again, that means that it's okay, everything's good. If the status of the request itself is 200, that means it found the file just fine. Then we're going to set outMessage to be response.txt. That's the text version of the XML HTTP request. Otherwise, we're going to set outMessage to say there's a problem with the request, and then give the status so we know a little bit more about what's going on. And from the snippet, we grabbed that comment that says, do something here with outMessage. That's what we're going to do, and that's actually all we're going to have to do. That's going to be the very last bit. First off, we're going to declare a new variable called prevwin, so we don't have to type something in over and over again. And that's going to be set to document.getElementById previewWin. If you want to type in document.getElementById over and over and over again, you can, but I'd prefer not to. Now we want to set prevwin.innerHTML. And as you might guess by now, that is outMessage. But now we need to put it somewhere precisely. We do that by saying prevwin.style.top is parseInt. That gets the integer value of whatever variable we pass, and it's going to be ypos. Remember, we set the ypos and xpos up above. We're going to take that, add 2 to it, and then we also have to end it with px, because style.top requires a number followed by the string px. We'll do the same thing for prevwin.style.left. and that's equal to parse int xpos plus 2 plus px. What's coming in xpos and ypos are the same strings that we're setting up here. So for instance, if ypos comes in as 25px, we want to take that 25, add 2 to it to make it 27, and then add px to the end of it so that it becomes 27px. What this is going to do, because we were at certain coordinates, if we're adding 2 to the top and we're adding 2 to the left, that's going to put it slightly down and slightly right of our mouse. And that's where we want our little window to show up. We're setting prevwin.style.top and prevwin.style.left to be the x and y coordinates a little bit down and to the right of where our cursor moved over the link, because that's where we want the little preview window to show up. If you wanted the preview window to show up somewhere else, you would just change how you're setting top and left. What we're doing is taking in ypos and xpos. Those are going to be strings just like the ones we're creating here. So for instance, if it's at, say, xpos and ypos of 25px, 25px, we want to take the integer part of 25px, which is 25, add 2 to it for 27, and then concatenate px at the end to come up with 27px. If you put that into prevwin.style.top, that tells the browser to show that window at that particular location. There's just one thing we need more to actually add something at that particular location, and that's we need to set prevwin.style.visibility. Remember we said before it was hidden? Now we want it to show up. You have to tell the browser to make it visible. And that's all you need to do to make it show up. The problem is that if you made it show up every time you moved the cursor anywhere onto a link, you'd have a window showing up. Now we want to make the window be able to also go away. And we'll do that here. prevwin.onMouseOut. That means when we leave the preview window, when we move the cursor away, we call function. This is going to be an anonymous function because it's a single liner. So might as well just stick it in. And it's just document.get element by ID preview win.style.visibility equals hidden. And that's all there is to show contents. We're checking the ready state, then we're checking the status. We're setting up out message to either be our value of what we read in or an error message saying there was a problem. We're creating prevwin to contain our little preview window. We set its inner HTML. We set its top and left values. We set its visibility to be visible. And we gave it a way to go away after it's been created and we've looked at it. So let's save that. And then we go back to our HTML file and we preview it in the browser. And now when we scroll over each of these links, the first part of the new page appears and then disappears as we move away. And that, simply enough, is how you do smarter links with AJAX. In the previous example, I showed how to use AJAX, JavaScript, and CSS to give a little preview for any links on your page. And you might be thinking, yeah, but that'd be a real pain to add to my site. But at the very end, I promised to show in this lesson how easy it would be to do that. So that's what I'm going to be doing now. And if you're following along with the exercise files, we're looking at AJAX/chapter 04. And I'm going to go into my 04 folder and into a new folder I have called WebDev. And in WebDev, I have a whole bunch of different files. And if I open up index.html in Firefox, you'll see that what I have is your typical page with a table and a header and a whole bunch of links. And you could make some guesses as to what these files are, but you might not really know what they contain. You know, you can cursor over it and yeah, you see their links and you can see the name of it and you can see what the link says. But it'd be really handy to be able to look at this instead and say, oh, I really wonder what was here before loading up every single page trying to find something. So that's what we're going to do right now. And you're going to see exactly how much work you have to do to add this to any site. So go back here, and I'm going to open up the index page, and I've dropped my CSS and JavaScript files in this folder as well. And I'll open them all up in BBEdit. Here's the script.js file. It's the exact same as the script.js file I had in the previous lesson. And this is all you're going to see of it. We make no changes to it at all. Here's a CSS file from the previous example. The only thing I'm going to change here is there was a lot of stuff that was specific to that exercise. So I'm going to delete everything that doesn't have anything to do with preview win and save that. And finally, in index.html, I'm going to add 3 lines. I'm going to add a script source equals script.js, type equals text/JavaScript, end script, that's line 1, link rel equals style sheet, href equals script.css, end link, and then down in the body, I'm going to add a line, div id equals preview win, and div. And that's it. That's all I'm going to change. I'll save this, and now I'll load it up in my browser. And here we are again. Looks exactly the same, right? Now when I go over any of the links, you can see that we're seeing a little bit of what's on the page if I follow this through. So you saw I added nothing to the CSS. Actually, I just cleaned up a little bit. I did not even touch the JavaScript file. And all I did with the HTML was add in the preview win div, which actually could have been anywhere on the page. I just put it up at the top so I didn't have to scroll around. And I added a script tag and a link tag in the head. If you want to make this even more flexible, you could add code to the JavaScript to create the preview win div on the fly if it doesn't exist. But I wanted to do this without touching any of the JavaScript so that you would see that this really will translate easily. And obviously, if you want the little pop-up to look different, all you have to do is change your CSS file. So now if we go back to our text editor, you can see all we changed was we added these 2 lines and this div down here in the body, which again can be absolutely anywhere, or even could be moved into the JavaScript itself. In our next lesson, we're going to start looking at dynamic forms and what you can do with them with a little bit of AJAX. In this chapter, we're going to talk about dynamic forms, how to make forms friendlier and more useful to your audience. Along the way, we're also going to talk about when you'd want to use the XML content field of the XML HTTP request object, and also talk some more about code reusability. Here's a simple form with a single field. When you start typing it in, there's, 50 different states, and some of them have names that can be a little difficult to spell for people, or possibly you want them to always be capitalized in a certain fashion. Somebody might be typing in California. If you could see what I'd done there, I just typed in the letters C and A, and JavaScript filled in the rest of the field. When I first typed in the letter C, I got a drop-down that offered all the states that start with C. Along with typing in states, I can also take my mouse and hover over any of these states and use that to choose one. I clicked on Connecticut and that got filled in. If I type in a letter for a state that doesn't exist, the field turns bright yellow to let me know that I've entered in something invalid. Because of this, it becomes much more likely that you're going to get valid data here and much less likely that there's going to be a problem. And your users find it easier because they actually have to do less typing. In the next lesson, we'll start looking at the code. In this movie, we're starting off with static HTML and CSS files, and we're going to add on the capabilities that we'll need later on when we introduce the AJAX that we need in order to have the auto-filling style sheets. If you're following along with the exercise files, we're looking at ajax/chapter05/02/script.html. This is the HTML file, and we're only going to need to add a couple of things starting here in the input field on line 9. The first thing we need to add is a new attribute. Autocomplete equals off. This needs to be set off because some browsers will fill fields in for their users, and we want to make sure that that doesn't happen with this field because that wouldn't interact well with our AJAX component. So we've set it off. Then we need to add a break here because we don't want our next line to put this div on the same line as our field. Our div is called pop-ups. And then we end our div. And that's all we need to do to add to our HTML file. There's a little bit more that we're going to want to add to our CSS file. And let's do that now. Here we are in our CSS file. The first thing we want to do is set up a rule for pop-ups, which was the div we just created in our HTML file. And all we need to do for pop-ups is set a position absolute so that we can fiddle with that div later. Next, we need to say search field.error. This lets us change the color of the search field whenever we find an error. And then all we do is say background, color. We want it to be a nice strong yellow. So there's FC0. The primary thing that the AJAX file is going to be doing later is creating a whole bunch of divs. Each of those divs will be of a class type suggestions. Those are the suggested values for the state field. So let's set some rules for that. Div.suggestions. It's going to have a background color and want that to be white just in case our background is something else. Going to put some padding around it. 2 pixels top and bottom. 6 pixels left and right. And a border. Let's make it 1 pixel solid black. And the only other thing we want to do is, if you remember, when we put the mouse over any of the fields, the background color changed. So that's going to need a div.suggestions hover. And in that case, we say background color, and let's make it a nice blue. And that's all we're going to need to do to our CSS file. In our next movie, we're going to start looking at the XML file that we're going to use to drive our AJAX program. A major component of AJAX is XML. So we need to spend some time actually looking at this XML file so we can understand what the code does to work with it. If you're following along with the exercise files, this is ajax/chapter05/03/us-states.xml. And what this file contains is a listing of the 50 US states and their abbreviations. But it's doing it in a precise manner, which is a characteristic of XML. In this example, you'll see that there is one tag called choices. And it begins up at the top at line 2. And you'll see it ends down at line 203 with an end choices. Inside choices, there are 50 items. There's a tag of item, end item, another item, end item, another item, end item. Each item contains 2 objects, a label and a value. So the label, in this case, is Alabama, with a begin label and an end label, and a value is AL, with a begin and end value. In this code, we only care about what's in the label. This XML file can be used for many different purposes on the same web server, so it's okay that we're going to use some fields and not others. But you'll see there's item, label value, item, label value, item, label value, item, label value, over and over for all 50 states. You also need to notice that it is done in alphabetical order by state name, not by state abbreviation. So for instance, New York is alphabetically before North Carolina, so New York is before North Carolina, even though NY alphabetically would come after NC. It's alphabetized by state, not by abbreviation. Now we're going to look at how the XML is read in the AJAX file. Now it's time to add the AJAX to our page. For those of you following along in the exercise files, we're looking at AJAX/chapter05/04/script.html. And the only thing we need to add to the script.html page at this point is a script tag. It hasn't had any JavaScript yet, so it hasn't needed one, and now it will. So script source equals script.js, type equals text/JavaScript. End script. And that's all there is to the HTML. There's a lot of things going on in the JavaScript just to do the simple states autofill, so we're splitting it up into two parts. First part is going to talk about AJAX. There's just a few things we need to do here in order to add the AJAX. As usual, we're going to start off with the window.onload because we want some things to happen when the window loads the first time. And we want to initialize everything, so let's call init all in that case. As usual, we want to set up our XHR variable and set it to be false. And we're going to create an array called states array. And it's going to be a new array. After that point, well, we need a function init all. And when this page loads, what we want to do is say that anytime somebody is typing something in the search field, we want to grab it and look at it. Now, the name of that field is search field, and what we want to do, if they're typing in it, is we want to check an event, and the event that we want to check is on key up. You press a key on the keyboard. When you take your finger off the key, this event will be triggered. So we want to set that up for later. Let's say document.get element by ID. Search field dot on key up equals something called search suggest, and then we'll have to write search suggest later. Actually, just so that we don't forget about it, let's add it now down at the end. So we put function search suggest down there, and that'll be something that we fill in later. Putting it there will remind us that we're not done writing our JavaScript yet, but we don't have to take away from where we are now in order to write it. We can keep going with what we have. So now we need to set up our XHR request. For those of you following with the exercise files, we're going to go over and open up the AJAX request.txt file and copy and paste it into our code. Now, it's not precisely what we want, but it's darn close. And everything is fine up to here. We're not going to call it show contents. Instead, we're going to be calling a function we want called setStatesArray, which similarly we'll have to be writing very soon. And the one other thing we need to check is the URL, because we don't have a URL variable here. We're just going to hardcode in the name of the file that we want to open. And that is our initAll function. As we just added something referencing setStatesArray, now we need to create the setStatesArray function. And this is going to happen whenever we have successfully read in our XML file. Our function setStatesArray is going to be called whenever the ready state field in our XHR object changes. Now, we already have a little snippet that handles that, so let's switch over and open that up. Here's our AJAX response. I'm going to copy it, and then we're going to paste it into setStatesArray. Again, this is pretty much a framework for what we want. The one real difference is here that we're not going to be setting up out message, because we don't have one. We just want to initialize that array that we're going to use later. And what we want to be doing here is we want to be processing through the XML data that we read in. If you recall, when I was talking about reading in XML, in an earlier chapter I was saying sometimes you'll want to use the response text and sometimes you'll want to use response XML. This is one of those cases where we want the XML. So just to make sure that things are fine first, we're going to say if xhr.response XML. And that'll tell us if everything is fine with what we're expecting to get. If it is, new variable called all states, and that's going to be set to xhr.response XML.get elements by tag name item. Remember how in the last chapter we did get elements by tag name and passed it an A tag? But that was looking at the HTML. In this case, we're doing the exact same thing, but we're looking at the results of our XHR object. The response from the AJAX call can be processed just like anything else with a DOM. And in this case, we want all the items inside that file. This gives us an array of all of them. Now we loop through it. For var I equals 0, I less than all states dot length I plus plus. And now what we want to do here is a little odd, so I'll try and explain it carefully. We're going to now assign values to that states array that we initialized at the very beginning of this code. States array sub I. So for each time we go through this loop, we're going to set up the next in this array of state names. What we set it equal to is the ith value that we found in this XML file. And that is in all states sub I, because remember that's an array also, get elements by tag name label sub-0 dot first child. Now, if you remember back looking at that XML file, we had 50 items. Each of those items had a label, and then each of those labels contained the name of a state. So we start off by getting all the items using get elements by tag name, but then within that, we can use get elements by tag name again to get the labels. And then we want first child because we actually want the text value, the state name itself. The one last thing we need to do here, besides get rid of this comment, is put up an error message at this point. It just says alert. There was a problem with the request. And we can add on the error, just the status, just to give us some interesting piece of information in case there's a problem that we need to fix. In the next lesson, we're going to fill in the search suggest function, which is going to handle giving the different options to the user based on what they enter in the search field. In this movie, we'll be adding the JavaScript that handles reading in the search field value and using that to generate a dynamic list of possible states that the user could enter. If you're following along with the exercise files, we're looking at ajax/chapter05/05/script.js. We're down here at the bottom where we've put up a shell of the search suggest function, but we haven't actually put anything there. So let's start doing that now. The first thing we're going to do is set up a new string. Var string equals document.get element by ID search field. This is the function that gets called anytime they press a key. So the first thing we need to do is get the new value in the field. Next, we want to clear any errors that there might have been. So we do that by setting the class name equal to nothing. If there's an error, class name gets set to be error because they've just typed something in, we don't know whether or not there's an error. So we'll start off setting it to be nothing, and then we'll set it to be an error if later on we find there is one. So now we want to see if our new string isn't equal to nothing, which means they typed in something. And so we need to set the inner HTML of the pop-ups div to be nothing as well. So document.get element by ID pop-ups dot inner HTML equals nothing. Because we don't know what they've typed in yet. And it could be that they've typed in something that rules out some or all of the possibilities that were in that pop-up earlier. So we need to start all over again generating it from scratch. And here's where we do that. For var I equals 0, I less than states array dot length. We're now going to loop through the states array, looking to compare what's in it to what's been entered. And the first thing we do is we set up something called this state. And that is going to be set to states array sub I dot node value. That is the state that is saved in the ith position in the states array. So that's what we're going to compare our string to. If this state dot to lower case dot index of string dot to lower case equals 0. What that is that they might be typing in uppercase, they might be typing in lowercase, they might be typing in some mixture. We don't know, but we want it to still be set equivalent if they've typed in something that matches. So we're going to take whatever they entered and make it lowercase. And we're going to take our state name and make it lowercase. And then we're going to see, do we find one inside the other? If they've typed in new, N-E-W, we want to find New York, New Hampshire, New Jersey, and so on, New Mexico. So we want to see this is what they just entered forced into lowercase. If we find this string inside the state name, that's the index of this state to lowercase. If we find it at position 0, that means it was found, and found at the beginning of the string. We don't want to just see if it's there anywhere. Maybe they would type in the letter E, and there's plenty of states that have an E somewhere in their name. However, there are no states that start with E. So we want to make sure it's at the very beginning of the name. If this is true, we want to set up a variable that we're just going to call a temp div, because, well, that's what it is. Equals document dot create element div. There's our new temporary div. Temp div dot inner HTML equals this state. This state is the one that we just grabbed out of the states array. Temp div dot onClick. That's what we want to do if they happen to scroll over it and click it. It's set to make choice. Temp div dot class name equals suggestions. And finally we set document dot get element by ID pop-ups, and we append a child on to it. And that child is temp div. So for every state that matches what the user has typed in so far, we add a new div onto pop-ups that contains that state. Now we're not done yet, but we don't want to forget that there's a make choice function here. So let's add on function make choice for later. Now we're here at the end of this if. Nothing happens between that and the beginning of the next for. But now we've looped through every state. And for every state that matched, we've added a new div onto pop-ups. So we've hit that point. Now we want to actually put this thing out there and see what we have. So we have a new variable, found count. And that is set to document.get element by ID pop-ups dot child nodes dot length. That's going to tell us how many states we found. We could be keeping track as we went along, but this simple line will tell us how many matching states we found. And there's really two states we care about. If found count equals 0, well, if there's 0, we know we have an error because at least one should have been found. And if that's the case, we say document.get element by ID search field. That's the field that they're typing in, remember. Dot class name equals error. And this is what makes it go yellow, because we set the CSS that if search field has a class name of error, it turns yellow. So just saying we found 0 states that matched, we know we have an error, so just setting the class name will immediately turn it yellow. However, if found count equals 1, and we have a typo here, this should be 2 equal signs. If found count is 1, then we want to set something else to happen, which in this case is get element by ID search field dot value, and we're going to be set that to be the only state we've got. It only matched one possible state, so we might as well just put that state in the field. They've typed in CA. There's only one state that begins with CA. Might as well put that in there so they don't have to type in all of California. And so we're going to set that to be document.get element by ID. Grab the state name that we have out of the pop-ups field, and it's in first child, and it's in the inner HTML of that. And we've got that, so that's filled in. But then we need to blank out the pop-up because there's no point in having it popped up once you've filled in that field. And then finally, we need to finish off the end of the if str isn't equal to anything. And that is all of search suggest. In our next lesson, we'll finish off make choice, and then we'll test out our code and see how well it works. In this lesson, we're going to write the last bit of JavaScript and test out all our code. If you're following along in the exercise files, we're looking at AJAX chapter 05/06/script.js. The one last bit of code we need to write is the one that's triggered when these are clicks on one of the pop-up options. So we're down here in make choice, and we're passing it in EVT. First thing we want to do is set up a new variable called this div, so we can check to see what div it is. And we want to say, as we have previously with event, does it exist? If it does, then we'll set this div to event.target. Otherwise, it's sent to window.event.sourceElement. In either case, that's going to be the name of the state itself. So, given that we have the name of the state itself, what we want to do is the same thing we did in these 3 lines here. So let's make life easy on ourselves, and we'll just copy that and paste it here. Get rid of some of that indentation. So search field.value, in this case, will be set to this div.innerHTML, or we're resetting search field to be the name of the state that they clicked on. And then we clear out the pop-ups inner HTML, which gets rid of all the options because they've selected one. So let's go try it out. we need to save this file, then go back to our HTML file and preview it. Here we are, and we try typing in some options. For instance, here's New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Mexico, and New York. Clicked on it, and there it was. Now, if we delete that, we type in, say, E, it will immediately come up yellow because there are no states that start with E. If we delete it, it goes back to white. Another thing we need to check is, for instance, what happens when you enter in enough of a state that it should know what to do. In this case, we did. It came up with Kansas. Kansas is also useful as a test for this one because we want to make sure that Arkansas does not also come up. So again, here's all our different possibilities. And click on one, and it works. So far, this is looking pretty good. In our next lesson, we're going to see how to take what we've got and extend it and make it a little more useful. In our last movie, we saw how to create some AJAX code that would allow a dynamic pop-up, helping the user enter a valid value. There was one problem with the script, really, and that is that it was much too specific. It was great if you always wanted to handle states, but if you ever wanted to do something else, you're going to have to change a whole lot of stuff. In this lesson, we're going to change it to handle colors instead of states, but we're also going to make it a whole lot more generic so it can be used for other things in the future. In front of you, you'll see our example. Let's say our favorite color is blue. I typed the letters BLU, and because that was the only color that started with those letters, my background is now blue. If I prefer green, I type in GRE, and now my background is green. Typing in W immediately gets me white. So let's switch over to our text editor and see how it's done. For those of you following along with the exercise files, we're looking at AJAX/chapter05/07. In this case, we're looking at the colors.xml file. This is the XML file we're going to be using for this example, and it's simply called colors.xml. Its root is colors, and then there are a number of different colors in it, each with a name and a value. In this case, name is the only thing we're going to be looking at, but we could be using value for something else if we wanted to. We're starting off with our HTML file from last time, and we're just going to change a couple of fields. I want to change it from autofill states to be autofill colors. Instead of please enter your state, I'm going to say please enter your favorite color. And I'm going to change the ID from search field to color field. And that's all that needs to be done with this HTML file. Let's move over to our CSS file. We need to change a couple of things. First off, because we've changed search field to be color field, we need to change that there, and we also need to change it here. Save that as well. And now we get on to the interesting part, which is our JavaScript. Primarily what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be setting up an assortment of variables to store the information about the XML file so that in the future it's pretty clear up front which things you're going to want to change because they'll be right up front, up top in variables. So let's make states a little more generic, and we'll call it data array. Next, we're going to set up a variable called form field. And that form field, we're going to set it equal in this case to be the field on the page that we're going to be paying attention to, which is called color field. And that way, if at some later point we decide to apply this JavaScript to something else, all we gotta have to do is change the one form field variable, and we don't have to go and make sure it's changed in 20 different places in our code. And next, we need a URL of the XML file, which is going to be colors.xml. So because we're going to be using form field, we can get rid of this. And so instead of a hard-coded search field, we'll now just say form field. And we'll be doing that throughout our entire script file. Next up, down here in set states array, we're going to make this more generic again and call it set data array. Instead of the hard-coded XML file here, we're just going to use the variable URL. And we scroll down a little more. Now, because we're using set data array instead of set states array, we're going to call this function set data array. And here we're having item and label, but that's not what they're called in colors. .xml. So we want to make it again a little more generic. So we're going to put our values into variables so they can be more easily changed later. And in this case, we'll call them tag 1 and tag 2. Var tag 1 equals color. Var tag 2 equals name. A little further down, instead of all states, we want to call this now all data. And instead of item, it's now tag 1. Instead of all states, it's all data again. And instead of states array, it's going to be data array. And we keep doing that throughout the document. Here, instead of label, I'm going to call it tag 2. The one other change we're going to make is instead of setting data array sub I here to be the first child, we're going to set it equal to first child dot node value. And that way we don't need to do that later on. So we'll need to remember to take that out. Now we scroll down to search suggest function. Again, search field goes away and is turned into the form field variable. Here, I'm just going to copy this so I can use it again and paste it again there. In our loop here, instead of states array, it's called data array. And again here. And this is where we can take out node value because we're storing the actual value that we want in data array sub I. We don't have to go looking any further for it. Now we're going to change this state to be this field. And that means we can change that not just here, but also here and here. Next change we need to make is down here, is get element by ID search field. It needs to change to form field. And we're going to make one other actual good size change now that we're almost all the way down to the end. Because these lines of code and these lines of code are almost identical, and we also want to add a tiny bit of functionality to this, I'm going to split these out into a new function called setColor. So here, instead of setting this value to this value, I'm just going to call setColor and pass it in this value. And then I can get rid of this line entirely because it's going to be further down. And I'm going to do something similar down here, which in this case actually I'm just going to copy it and paste it. And then I'm going to call setColor this div.innerHTML. Now here we are down in our new function, setColor. And the first thing we need to do is get rid of that search field and call it form field. And we need to change its value. I'm going to copy in new color. And it needs to be set to new color. So there's how we're resetting the value in our form field. And there's one last change we need to make, which is we want to set document.bgcolor also equal to new color. And that is going to change our background so that we get to see what our new color is. So now we save it, and we go back to our HTML file, and we see how that looks in our browser. So please enter your favorite color. We'll go to blue, and there we are. And if we want to set it to something else, we just say W, and that's the only color that starts with W, so we get white, or let's say pink. So that is how you make a dynamic form field using AJAX. Next up, we're going to look at some more uses of AJAX. In this chapter, we're going to talk about using AJAX to create dynamic maps. Say, for instance, you're a teacher and you've got a brand new classroom full of kids. You want to know who's sitting where, who's who, their names, a little bit more about them. So here we've got a floor plan of a classroom, 25 seats. And in order for the teacher to learn more about each student, all she has to do is figure out which seat she cares about, and then click on it. A little window pops up giving the student's name, seat number, which lunch period they're in, and which reading group they're in. To close it, you just click in the close box in the top right. And the same for each one of these. The right box lights up, and then you have the person's name. All of this is created dynamically via AJAX and JavaScript. It's just reading in an XML file that contains all of this data and then creates this dynamically. In this chapter, we're going to go through what it takes to create this. The HTML, the CSS, the XML, and the JavaScript, plus a little bit of Dreamweaver to help us figure out where boxes go. Next up, the HTML. Here's where we start to put the pieces together to come up with our dynamic AJAX maps. If you're following along with the exercise files, we are in AJAX/chapter06/02/script.html, where we'll see that we have a very bare bones outline of an HTML page. At this point, we're going to add just a little bit to it, mostly to bring in our picture. Most of the other work will be done inside Dreamweaver in a later lesson. The title of our page is Student Seating Chart. Inside our body, we have an image tag. The source equals seatingchart.png. Doesn't have to be a PNG, but that gives us the best bang for the buck. It's the most usable image for the smallest file size. The height is 423, and the alt attribute is classroom. And after that, we want to add a single div, which is going to end up being that little detail information about any given student. We're going to reuse the same one for all of them. So we're going to give it an ID of detail and end div. And that's all we're going to do here. There's a whole lot more to add, and in our next lesson, we'll get into the CSS. In this lesson, we're going to look at adding enough CSS to get started with our student seating chart. The first thing that we're going to have to do is add a CSS link to our HTML. If you're following along with the exercise files, we are in AJAX/chapter06/03/script.html. So by now you should know how to do this, but it's link href equals script.css, rel equals style sheet, type equals text/css. That's all we need to add to our script.html file, but there's quite a bit we're going to have to do with script.css, because right now there's nothing there. So let's start off by saying what we want in the body. And what we're going to want here is to set the font family, and we'll just pick a few nice fonts. This is in quotes because it's multiple names. If it has a space, you need to have quotes in it. And you need to end up with a generic font, always. Then because we can pick out a div, and it's going to highlight, we need to come up with a class, and we'll call it pickDiv. And if they choose a div, we want the z-index to be 3, so it will overlay the usual z-index, which is 1. We'll give it a background color of red. But we don't really want it to be a dark red. We want it to have some opacity. It ends up looking kind of like a pale pink. So an opacity of 20%. Next off, we have an image on the page that we want to just be, we want a little bit more margin than we'd normally get. So let's give it a margin top of 10 pixels and a margin left of 5 pixels. That'll make it stand out just a bit. Now, if you remember, we created an ID called detail in the HTML. Here's where we say what we want it to look like. Now, we want it to be hidden because it's only going to pop up when we tell it to. And it needs to be positioned absolute because in order for us to tell it where it needs to go, it has to be positioned absolutely. Going to give it a background color of white. Going to give it a border of 1 pixel, solid gray, a z-index of 5 because we want it to show up on top of the pick div if the two overlap. A width of 100 pixels should be enough. A height of 75 pixels. We're going to set overflow to be hidden on the off chance that there's too much data to put in it. We don't want it to overflow and look silly. And we want it to be fairly small, so let's set a font size of 0.6 ems. And finally, we're going to give it a padding of 5 pixels to put some space around it. And the last rule we're going to add to the CSS file, if you noticed when we looked at the page in action, there was a small close box in the top right-hand corner of the detail. So we need to create the close box. And here's the rule for that. We'll put a font style. Let's make it Monaco or any sans serif. Make it positioned, absolute, because we're going to place it inside the detail box. Top 1px, left 97 pixels. That's just within the 100 across. Font size is again 0.6 ems. Border here is going to be 2 pixel solid gray, and give it a margin of 3 pixels. And that's all we need to add to our CSS right now. Next up, we're going to go into Dreamweaver and have it do all the plain and boring work of creating little absolutely positioned divs all over that page. In this movie, we've opened up our HTML and CSS files inside Dreamweaver. We've done that because creating a whole bunch of absolutely positioned divs is something that a WYSIWYG editor is really good at. Using Dreamweaver, you can just draw the boxes and not have to figure out for yourself exactly where everything begins and ends. For those of you following along in the exercise files, this is AJAX/chapter 06/04, and we're looking at script.html and script.css. In the insert bar, you'll need to go to Layout. And then the second button over, you'll see is Draw AP Div. AP stands for Absolutely Positioned. So click that. And you'll get crosshairs. And what you'll need to do is draw a positioned box on top of each of the boxes on the screen. But first, after you draw each one, you'll draw it, and then you select it. You select your div, and then go down to the Property Inspector. We'll give it a name of S01. Then we tab over to the z-index and blank it. And now we go on to the next one. Click on Draw AP Div. Draw our next box. Select it. This one's going to be S02. Tab over to z-index. Blank it. Our third. There it is. Select it. S03. Delete the z-index, and so on. You'll see that as we create them, each one is showing up in our local style. Keep doing this for the 25 boxes on the screen. When you're done, you should have S01 through S25, and through the magic of editing, we'll come back and I'll have all of them done. Okay, now I've got 25 position divs, and hopefully you do too. You'll see over here I have 1 through 25, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to select them over here, and then I'm going to right-click and choose Move CSS Rules. It comes up with the default of script.css, which is exactly what I want. I say, OK, and now all of these rules are inside our script.css file. And now I can save both files, and I'll have exactly what I need to start working with AJAX. Now let's go and take a look at the code that Dreamweaver created for us that we didn't have to type in by hand. What you'll see in the HTML file is a whole bunch of divs with IDs from S01 to S25. And in our CSS file, you'll see everything we had before, but down at the end, there's a whole bunch of new rules from S01 through S25, all with position of absolute, height and width of about 50, and a particular top and left so that each position is unique for each div on the screen. It looks like it's still the same boxes that were there before, but there's now a whole lot more code behind it. Next up, we'll take a look at the XML file that drives this AJAX application. In this lesson, we're taking a look at the XML file, full of students and information about the students. If you're following along with the exercise files, we're looking at AJAX/chapter06/05/students.xml. This file contains information about 25 students. For each student, there's a seat number, a first name, a last name, a reading group, and a lunch period. This can be generated, for instance, out of something like Excel. But the nice thing is that if you're generating it out of, say, Excel, for instance, or out of pretty much any kind of database, that if two kids move around, you have to change them in Excel, and then you re-output this file, but you don't have to make any changes at all to the HTML or the CSS or the JavaScript. So long as the file is in the right place with the right name, it will all just work. As you can see as we scroll down, there's all kinds of information here for each student. You could have all kinds of other information if you wanted it, or if you happen to get it in an XML file. These are the only fields that we're caring about for our little demonstration. And as you can see, it goes on all the way down, and there is, all in all, 25 of them. As you see, the last student number on the screen is in seat 24. That's because the student for seat 25 is actually a few rows up. And what this was there to test is to make sure that the student information has been moved to elsewhere in the file so that we can test what happens when one of the rows is out of order. The XML file doesn't care about the order of students, and neither does the JavaScript. It's all going off of what is the seat number. And in this case, it's seat number 25, so this is the 25th that AJAX is going to care about. Next up, we're going to start adding some of that AJAX code. In this movie, we're going to write the code that's going to add the AJAX functionality to our dynamic map example. If you're following along with the exercise files, we're in AJAX/chapter06/06/script.js, which right now is a blank file, so we need to add some stuff to it. As usual, we start off with our window.onload, and it's going to be set to initAll. We have to create our variable xhr, which will start off initialized as false. We can have our variable data array again is set to new array. By this point, a lot of this should be looking very familiar. And our variable URL is set to students.xml. As you'll guess, next up, we're going to have our function initAll. And at this point, we're going to go and open up our code snippets, because this is the same code that we've written a number of times so far, so why do it again? So we switch over, take a look here, open up code snippets, and we want our AJAX request.txt. What we're going to want is this part of the code, copy it, and we'll paste it in here. So here's our if window XML HTTP request, XHR is new request, else if window ActiveX object, try catch E, and end this. We're down here, if XHR on ready state change equals show contents, except here we're going to want to call this function, we're going to want to call it set data array, because that's what we're doing here. Get URL and true, and here's where we actually send off the request, else alert. And actually, this is exactly what we wanted it to do. We only had to make those couple of changes. Now we're going to end up this function. We'll set var all divs equal to document.get elements by tag name div. This is going to give us an array of all the divs on our page. For var I equals 0, I less than all divs.length, and increment to I. And then for every div, all divs sub I slash onClick is another function that we're going to add called feature one div. Now we know we need to add two functions here. The first one is called function set data array, and the second one is called function feature one div. And we put those there so that we know we won't forget to add them on later. But we know it needs to go into set data array, and that's something to handle our XHR response. And in fact, we know that we have that in our code snippets folder. So let's go open that up. Here's our AJAX response. We'll copy this out. And now we're going to paste it into set data array. So we start off, we check to see if ready state is 4, check to see if status is 200. But now we're going to want to do something else besides handle out message. So delete that line, delete that comment, and we'll change this to an alert. Alert. There's a problem with the request. And that way, if there's a problem, the message will still show up. But if everything's okay, we're back here. And in that case, we want to say if xhr.response XML. If we got XML back, because we're expecting to get XML back, there's certain things that we want to do. If that's the case, we're going to set a new array up called var all data equal to xhr dot response XML dot get elements by tag name student. And this gets every student in the students.xml file. So we're going to have an array of student information. So now we need to go through that array. Here's where we do that. For var I equals 0, I less than all data dot length, and increment I. Start off, we're going to set up a temporary object. So we're going to create it. This temporary object is going to contain all the student information that we care about. So all we have to do to create a new object, say var temp object equals new object. Same as any other type of object in JavaScript. So temp object dot first name equals. Now we could write out this code over and over and over again that goes and gets the first name. But then we're going to have to repeat it for the first name and the last name and the seat and the lunch period and the reading group. So instead, we're going to throw it all into a new function later on. And that function is going to be called getVal for getValue. When I write it here, just remember I'll need to add it in later. And what we need to pass it is all data I, which is the ith position in the all data array, which is the one we're looking at now. And we need to pass it the string first name. And that is what's going to go into the first name field. Now, just so we make sure we don't forget to do this later, let's add our getVal function. We're going to pass in two variables, and inside we're going to call them the data and the tag. And I'm putting this getVal function inside setDataArray because it's not needed outside. And this way they can share some information between the two if they needed to. But there's no reason for it to be outside and available to the world. It only needs to be inside here. So keep your stuff as close together as you can. So here's first name, and now we can just repeat this for last name. Let me go back, because I never finished doing this. Here's the shell of our getVal function. Go back. Now we're going to copy our first name line and duplicate it because we need to do the identical thing for last name. So there it is again for last name. And now we can copy both those lines and change the first one to seat and pass it seat, and then lunch period, and one last one, which is reading group and reading group. Now what you should know by this point, but here's a reminder in case you've forgotten, JavaScript is flexible enough that you can create an object just by adding new properties to anything. So we just created temp object and we're adding these properties to it, and we didn't need to do anything else to make it actually exist. So once I've assigned values to it, they exist. So now finally we say data array sub I equals temp object. So everything inside temp object, all of those different properties get put back into a different array. So there are 5 fields, but those 5 properties all belong to one single object. So data array is an array of objects. Now it's time to finish the getVal function. And all we're going to do here is say return the data dot get elements by tag name, the tag. Now that gives us back an array, so we want the very first entry in that array, so that's sub 0. And then we want the first child of that node. So there's first child, and then we want the value of that first child. And that is the actual value of what we want. Saying return means that getVal, being past these 2 fields, returns this first name value and will put it into the first name property of temp object. So instead of doing this big long line here over and over and over again, we can stick it all into one function that returns that value and then call that function over and over and over again here. So that made our code a little bit shorter. And if we decide to change something about that XML file later, we would only have to change this one line and not everything throughout the entire JavaScript file. And that's all we're going to do in this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to finish up writing the JavaScript now that we're done with all the AJAX part of our code. In this movie, we're going to add the final bit of JavaScript code to display our student information on the screen and to highlight the div that the user has picked. For those of you following along with the exercise files, we're looking at AJAX/chapter06/07/script.js. So we need to scroll all the way down to the bottom. And the very last thing that we're going to do here is finish off our feature1div function. That's all we've got left to do. So we start off saying var all divs equals document dot get elements by tag name and pass it in div. By now you should be familiar with lines like this. This gives you an array of all the divs on your web page. Now we need to loop through it for var I equals 0, I less than all divs dot length, I plus plus. And what we're going to do here is we need to clear the class name from all the divs. Only one of them has possibly been picked in the previous time we've come here, but just in case one of them has, we don't know which one, so we're just going to clear out all of them. So we say all divs sub I dot class name equals nothing. And that's the first part of our function. Next up, we need to grab the div that they clicked on. We do that by creating a new variable called the div, which can be a couple of different things depending on whether or not an event object exists at this point. If it does, then we want to grab event.target. Otherwise, we're going to set the div to window.event.sourceElement. And this is the div that they clicked on. That this line is set up in such a fashion so that it works in a number of different browsers. But it gives you the target of the div that was clicked. Now that we have that, we know which div was clicked on. We want to set this div dot class name to picked div. Now, if you recall back in the CSS file, we said any div with the class name of picked div would show up red and opaque. This is where that happens. We also wanted to create a new variable called the student, and we'll start it off initializing it as null. Going to do another loop here. This time for I less than data array.length, because we're going to go looping through all the data that we have. I plus plus. And if the div.id, that's the ID of our div, which is, if you recall, the seat name that we care about. If that ID equals data array sub I, because we're on the ith data array that we're looking at, dot seat. If they match, then we found the student that we're looking for. And in that case, we want to set the student equal to data array sub I. So let's scroll down. Now, in theory, there's a chance that no student may have been found. For instance, you may have an empty seat in the classroom. So let's start off by checking to see if the student exists. Because we set it to null when we first declared it and initialized it, if it wasn't reset here, it won't pass this test. If there's no student, then we don't want anything to happen, everything's fine. But if there is a student, we want to create a new variable called student info. And it's going to be set to document.get element by ID detail. That's a little detail div that's going to contain a little pop-up windows with the student information based on where they clicked. So it's student info is what we're going to be filling in. Now we're going to add another variable that's called the message. And it's going to contain the actual code that we want in this div. Span ID equals, here's our close box that we're adding. All it is the letter X inside a span, and then we add an H3. Now this is the first of several lines that are going to be used to set up the message. So now we say the message plus equals. That concatenates on to the same string. So we say the message plus equals the student dot first name plus space plus the student dot last name. And once again, more stuff will be added on to the same string. But now we want to end that H3, and then we want the seat number. So we seat colon space plus the student dot seat. And once again, we want to put this on a new line, so we stick in a break and then say lunch period colon space plus the student dot lunch period. And finally, message equals, here's another break, and the student is in reading group, and it's the student dot reading group. So that's where we set up the message. Now we need to do something with that message. So that goes into studentinfo.inner HTML is set to the message. And that's going to put all of that into the HTML of this little pop-up. But now we need to tell the little pop-up where it needs to go. So that goes into studentinfo.style.top is equal to the div.offset top, which is where the div itself is. We set the top to be based on the div.offset top. That's where the top of the div is. Now we're going to subtract 5 from that because we don't want it to be level with the div. We actually want it to be up a little bit. So we're going to do it over to the right and up just a little bit from the div that they selected. So as the top is smaller, it goes up. And then we concatenate px on, so that way we have a number and then end with px, and that's the number of pixels from the top. Next we need to say where we want it in terms of its left. So here's studentinfo.style.left, the div.offset left, and we're going to add 35 because that's going to push it over a bit to the right because it's that many pixels over from the left-hand side. And finally, we set studentinfo.style.visibility to make this actually show up on the screen, equal to visible. Because if you recall, the CSS said it should be hidden. And the very last thing we do is we set document.get element by ID close box dot onClick equal to an anonymous function. And what that anonymous function is going to do is go for document.get element by ID detail dot style dot visibility equals hidden. So in order to close this little detail information windowlet, we click on the close box, and that tells it to be hidden again. Now let's scroll all the way down to the end. All our close braces line up, and that should be the end of our JavaScript. In the next movie, we'll test this all and see how well it works. So now finally, we get to actually test our code and see how well all the pieces work together. If you're following along with the exercise files, I'm looking at AJAX/chapter06/08/script.html. And if you've been watching closely, you'll notice that there's actually one line I didn't add. So I need to do that now. And that's the line that actually adds the script to our HTML page. Because without that, it's not going to work at all. Script.js type equals text/JavaScript end script. Now that that's done, we save it and then load it into our browser. So let's try it. We click and somebody shows up in seat 5, and we can close the close box and it closed. Try another one. Try clicking over here. Nothing happens. That's good. Click here. And it's looking just the way we expect it to. One of the interesting things about this, if I then go and click on another one, it does the equivalent of clicking the close box and then clicking on a new div, because there is only the single detail windowlet. So moving it to here is the same as closing the old position and then opening it again here. So you don't have to close it if you just want to look at something else. So it's handy to be able to say, okay, that person is in seat 1, seat 2, seat 3, seat 4, and seat 5. And you can see, as we wanted it, the window is popping up a little bit up and to the right. Here's 10, 9, 8, 7, and 6. And it looks like everything is working just the way we want it to. Clearly, this can be modified in a number of different ways, but the framework is all there to be able to add any other type of functionality you want to this dynamic AJAX seating chart. In our next chapter, we're going to start looking at AJAX frameworks. In this lesson, we're going to talk about getting and exploring the Yahoo UI framework. If you're following along with the web browser, I'm looking at developer.yahoo.com, which is the Yahoo Developer Network. There's all kinds of useful information here, but we're going down to the place over here towards the bottom left that says UI, Yahoo User Interface. When we get there, there's a site with all kinds of stuff, just an immense amount of material, all of it geared towards helping people use the Yahoo User Interface library. The place to start is with the big orange button right in the middle that says Download UI. So we're going to do that, and it only takes a moment. Now we've downloaded the file, and we're going to go to our Downloads folder and see what we've got. Here's our Downloads folder. And there's a file here called UI240.zip. Double-click it to open it up. And let's see what we've got. You'll see that there's 5 folders and 2 files. The file is index.html, and the place to start is just by loading that into a web browser. So here we are with the index.html loaded into our web browser, and you see now that all of this documentation now exists on our local computer. So we don't have to be connected to the internet or always on Yahoo's site to know what's going on. Right up front, they've got welcome, some tips on getting started, and a whole lot of functional examples. information about CSS, utilities, UI controls and widgets. Let's go back to our desktop now and see what else we've got. First off, there's the Assets folder, and it contains some CSS and some JavaScript files to check out. Next up is Build. Build is where everything that you're going to want to code with exists. Animation, autocomplete, buttons, calendars, charts, color pickers, DOM, drag drop, events, fonts, everything you could pretty much want, it's there. Next up is the Docs folder. One of the things that is great about the UI library is simply the amount of documentation they've got on it. So you can see here that there is a ton of documentation. And any of these HTML files can be loaded into the browser to just look at them. Let's see something like, toolbarbutton.js.html. Let's see what it says. And it is actually the source for this .js file. And you can see it's got a tree structure. We can start off and go up to the very top, look at the editor itself, look at any one of these modules, look at these classes over here on the left, and a number of other files. So let's go back up to the top level. This is the API documentation, as it says, for the Yahoo User Interface Library. And we can just start typing here to look for anything. So we could type in, say, drag, because we're looking for something on drag and drop. And it tells me that all of these files have the word drag mentioned in them. So if you know there's something else that you particularly want, let's say we want to see what they've got in terms of XML HTTP requests, we put in XHR, and they've got a number of different files with information about any one of them. Back out to the desktop, back out to the UI folder, and we've got tests. Here in the test folder, we've got information that will help us test our stuff. For instance, we could test calendars, color pickers, DOM, drag and drop, image loader, logger, menus. And there's all kinds of information there that'll help you use the UI library to its full extent. In our next lesson, we're going to get into the UI framework examples and start seeing in more detail what UI is capable of. In this movie, I'm going to talk about the UI framework documentation, what it contains, and what you can find there. If you've downloaded the UI framework, then you already have most of the documentation. If you haven't downloaded it yet, don't fret, you can still get to it online. I'm at developer.yahoo.com here, and I go down on the left and I click Yahoo User Interface. And then I click on API Documentation. And that gives me the searchable API documentation for UI. If I've downloaded the framework, however, all I have to do is go to my UI folder, where I find the docs folder, open that, scroll down to index.html, open that in the browser, and I have the exact same window. So whether you are online or offline, you have access to the exact same documentation. From there, you can find anything about anything almost. So here we click on drag and drop, and it will tell us here what the drag and drop utility is and all about it. And now I can search drag drop utility if I want to. Or I can go back up to the top level, and let's say I want to know something about XML HTTP requests. I put in XHR, and I have all kinds of options here that I can learn more about. Put that in, and here I am at yahoo.util.datasource.html, which gives me all the information I could want about this particular file. So you can do this whether you're online or offline. However, if you've downloaded the framework, there's still one more important piece of information that you need. So go back up to the UI page, and under Using UI, click on Cheat Sheets, because they're absolutely worth getting. Best place to start, in my opinion. That there is for the user interface library. So just click on cheatsheets.zip, and you'll find it in your downloads page. Open it up, and then open up UE cheat sheets concatenated.pdf. You open it up in something that can view PDFs, and what you have is pages and pages of cheat sheets that give you a great deal of information about all of the useful parts of the library. For instance, this page covers the animation library. You have the simple use case, constructor, attributes object, animation properties, dependencies, what they call interesting moments in animation, things like on start, on complete, using the motion subclass, using the color anim subclass, other subclasses, solutions, and that's just one page. Here's another one on autocomplete, simple use case, constructor, interesting moments, and so on. Browser history manager, button, all perfect for viewing on screen or even printing out. And it's a great way to get to know what's in what library and what each part of that library does. And it's, for not very many pages, it packs quite a bit of information, especially when you don't really quite know where to start looking yet. Next up, we're going to start getting coding with UE. In this example, we're going to look at using some of the Yahoo User Interface Library, or the UE library, in order to put together an attractive web page with a lot of functionality without writing a lot of code. If you're not clear what the UE framework is, you want to go back and review the previous lesson. This is your typical image slideshow, but it's got a few extra features to it. For instance, when I click the next button, the current image kind of slides out and the next image bounces in. And it goes out and then new one bounces in. And so forth. And we can go back as well. There's a number of things going on in this. For instance, all of the images are being served off of the Flickr photo service, and what photos are being shown is coming out of an XML file. We're going to get into all of that starting in the next lesson, which will be about XML and Flickr. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about Flickr and photos and XML. Depending on how your system is set up, getting XML out of Flickr may or may not be a little bit of trouble. But it's worth doing simply so that you can use their files to run your AJAX programs on. Here's an example of the type of XML file you can get out of Flickr. If I just go to the search page, and I'm going to want to explore popular tags. And I know that I have some nice pictures under Paradise Ridge Sculptures. And I go there. There's a number of pictures here, all of which happen to be mine. And I decided that what I want to do is have a slideshow running on my system, appearing the way I want it to look. So what I'm going to do is grab the XML file of these pictures. Notice that I'm not logged in. Anybody can get to these pictures and do something similar. How you save it as XML depends on your browser, your system, and how your browser is set up to handle XML. In general, what you'll want to do is something like scrolling down to the bottom and grabbing this feed by right-clicking and doing a save link as, or you can also do it here on where it says latest and save link. Or you might be able to just go up to the location bar and grab the data that way. But once it's on your computer, you can then look at it in a text editor. Here we are in the text editor in the XML file that I've got from Flickr. And it doesn't actually have any of my pictures in it. What it has is a lot of text data about my pictures. So now what I need to do is create some HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and AJAX to do something with all this text data. And that's going to start in the next lesson. In this movie, we're going to start putting the pieces together of our HTML file. If you're following along with the exercise files, this is AJAX/chapter 08/03/script.html. This is a bare bones outline of an HTML file, and we're going to add a number of things to it to create our little slideshow. First off, we're going to add a few things in the body. To start off, we need an image. I'm going to call it ID equals pick mover. And it's actually going to be the image that's being moved around all over the place that you see. But because it doesn't actually exist itself as an image, right now we're going to give it a height of 0 and a width of 0. It'll start off with a little dummy graphic called placeholder.gif, so we don't get a broken image icon on the screen. And some alt text, we'll just call it storage. Next, we need a div to hold all our topmost stuff, the 2 buttons, and our big image. We're going to call that ID equals center div, because it's stuff that needs to be centered in the middle. Inside there, we'll have a button, an ID called getPrev for getting the previous image, and we'll call that previous. And next up is an image. Its ID is going to be big pic, because it's the big picture that you see right in the middle. And its same source can also be placeholder for now. Its alt text is going to be slideshow, and we'll align it to the top to get it just where we want. There's another button, so we can just copy this one, except we're going to call it get next, and it will say next. And then we'll end our div. And the last thing that we have on our page is another div. This one's called picture bar, and it's going to contain all those thumbnails across the bottom. Now we also need to add our usual style sheet equals style sheet href equals script.css. And we'll add our usual script tag. Type equals text / JavaScript. Oops, typo there. That should be equals. That's the end. And then we need an end script tag. But we're going to need some other scripts here. Now, because we're using the Yahoo User Interface Library, their documentation will tell us what other scripts we need. So now we're going to switch over and look at some of the documentation. For instance, this is one of the cheat sheets, or several of the cheat sheets in one file. And I know I'm going to be wanting to do something with animation. So I can guess already that I'll need the animation library. But there's something useful down here at the bottom, under dependencies. It says, animation requires the Yahoo Global Object, the DOM collection, and event utility. So now I know I need 4 different libraries. Now, because of other stuff that we're going to be doing in this, I also know I need the selector library and the connection library, because the connection library handles all the AJAX functionality, XML HTTP request, and the selector library, more or less, it lets you tell UE to handle all the dog work of parsing through a DOM tree. So in order to add this to our page, we need to go back out here. And what I do when I start working on a site is I take the UE library and I put it in a folder. And this contains everything. But I don't want everything in my finished site. So you see, it's just outside of the site folder, because we're working on the 03 folder. This is at the same level as that, so it's not going to be inside the folder. Then I create another folder and move that into my current working folder. and I call that UE as well. And then I'm going to go down to the build folder inside UE and open it up and figure out which files I need. Because I know we'll need animation, I can go here, and I know what I need is animation.js. So I'll drag that into my local UE folder. I know I'm going to need the event JavaScript, so I drag that in as well. As I said, I know I'm going to need connection, and I'm going to need the DOM. Scrolling down to the bottom, as I said, I'm going to need the selector. Selector is still in beta right now. It may not be when you're watching this. So there's selector. And finally, I need the Yahoo library itself. This is what they refer to as global. You always need it. And not only do you always need it, it always needs to be the very first one declared in your file. And so I grab that one as well. Now I should have 6 altogether, and I do, so I can close this. And now I can go back to my script file, and I know that I'm going to need script source equals UE/yahoo.js, type equals text/JavaScript, and end script. And now what I can do is copy this for the other times. So I copy, paste, and next I'll have animation, paste again, and I'll have event, again, connection, DOM, and selector beta. And that's all the scripts I'm going to need for this. You're always going to need to put yahoo.js first, and it's a good idea to always have your own local script be last. That way, if you're going to need to override something that is part of what they have, it'll be in your own script locally, and it will take precedence over any of their stuff. So there's our HTML file and the start of our JavaScript. And next up, we're going to get into the CSS. This lesson is going to cover the very minimal CSS that this exercise will need. If you're following along with the exercise files, we're looking at AJAX/chapter08/04/script.css. For the previous and next buttons, I know I'm going to need to add a style, but all I'm going to add for them is a margin of 100 pixels and then 50 pixels. Margin can have 1, 2, 3, or 4 numbers. If you have 2, the first number goes for the top and bottom, and the second for the left and right. So this is the same as saying margin top 100, margin right 50, margin bottom 100, and margin left 50. It's all in one. So that's button. Now there's that picture we're going to be moving around called pick mover. And because we're going to move it around, we need to make it position fixed. We've got that center div that contains a bunch of important stuff up at the top. And we want that to have a fixed height to push everything else down so we're not writing all over ourselves. So it needs to have a height of 300 pixels. And then there's our big picture in the middle. And it needs to have a margin of 20 px and 100 px. So a little bit of a margin at the top and bottom, bigger on the left and right. But we also need some more room over on the right. So we're going to call padding right 200px to push things over. And that's all our CSS needs. Everything else is done using JavaScript, AJAX, and the UE library. And that's coming up in the next lesson. And now finally, we're going to add our JavaScript, AJAX, and code from the UE library so you can see how it all works together. If you're following along with the exercise files, we're looking at ajax/chapter08/05/script.js. And what you'll see here is a bare bones outline of a JavaScript file. I already know in general what I'm going to need, so I've thrown a few functions on the page so that I can just fill in the skeleton later. I know I'm going to need the usual, window onload init all. I know I'm going to need something to contain all my images. And I know I'm going to have to keep track of what the current picture is. So I'm starting with that. And then there's my init all function. I know I'm going to need something called run slideshow. That was going to take in whether I'm going forward or backwards. And then I have a new function here called new slide in to handle bringing in a new slide. So this part all looks very standard. But now we're going to start to do a few more interesting things having to do with the UE library. To start with, I'm going to add something called a callback. And it'll make more sense once you see it. Helps if I spell it correctly. It's function past XHR and then inside that I'm going to set something called storepics inner HTML equal to xhr.response text. And you've seen this kind of thing throughout this entire course. After that, we're going to call a function we have yet to write called setupPics, and that'll set up all our pictures. And we end our callback. What's going to happen there, I'll cover in just a moment. First, I need to create some more variables. In particular, right now, I need to create one called storepics because it's used in that callback. Storepics equals document.create element div and var connection object, which is equal to Yahoo, all in caps, util, it's out of the utility library, connect, which is from that connection library, async request. And it gets passed get flickr pics.xml and callback. So what happens is we come into this function init all. This is a type of a function that's called a callback, and it just says when callback gets called later on, if it's passed some value that's equivalent to success, then it will do this function, passing in a value of xhr. It'll take its xhr response text and store it in storepics.innerHTML, and then call a function called setupPics. Now you'll notice that at the time we did this, we didn't have anything that called callback, didn't have anything that created storepics, didn't have an XHR, any of that. But that doesn't matter. It just matters that before that is actually called, that stuff is set up. So this is where that's going to happen. This connection object is going to use the Yahoo utility and connect library, and it's going to do an async request. It's going to do an XML HTTP request, an AJAX request, just like we've been doing all throughout this course. It's going to do a get. This is the file it's going to get. But it's a little bit different because the way they've set it up is when it's done, it's going to call something called callback. You can have any function name here. I'm just using the name callback so that it's clear what's going on. So when it gets to here, it's going to go to this Yahoo async request. When it's done, it will call the callback function. When that's called, it'll check to see if it's in a success state. That's handling all the ready states and the status, all that for you. You don't have to worry about it anymore. You just have to say success. If it's success, then we're going to deal with the XHR being passed in, and we're going to store it in the inner HTML of store pics, which I've created right here. So now I have some other stuff I need to create. Another variable called small pics, which is equal to document.get element by ID picture bar. This is where all the thumbnails are going to go. Now I need to do some scripting to handle the previous and next buttons. And again, I'm going to use the Yahoo library for that because it's simpler. Yahoo.util.event, because this is the event library, .add listener. You can tell an object to have a listener, and that will tell the object that it should keep listening for particular events that could possibly happen. It's not going to go out and spend a lot of time doing things. It's just going to listen. So we're going to add a listener. And that listener is going to be on document.get element by ID on our Get Previous button. We're telling it to listen for click. And if that is triggered, then we want to run a function. And that function is called run slideshow. And yes, that's the same run slideshow you've got down here. Now, that image offset is just simply something to keep track of which way we're going in the slideshow. We could have twice as much code. We could have a run next and run previous. But it's simpler to pass a +1 or -1 to give the code some idea of which is the next picture to display. Because this is get previous, we know we need to pass in a -1, and that's everything for this add listener. Because it's going to be almost identical for get next, we'll just copy it and paste it. Change get previous to get next, and change the function run slideshow to pass it a +1. And that's the only difference between the two. They both do the exact same thing. It's just whether they go to the next image in the group or the previous image in the group. Now, the one last thing we still have to do here is create this function called setUpPics. So let's get going with that. Now, this is still inside the init all, so we might as well just put our function inside there because there's no reason why it needs to be at a higher level. We're not going to be calling it anywhere else. Up here, we declared the variable allImages, and now we're finally going to do something with it. Allimages is set to yahoo.util.selector.query image and store pics. Over the last few lessons, you've probably seen a great deal of code that involves parsing through the XML files, looking for this div or that tag or this part of the DOM tree. The Yahoo selector library handles all that for you. I know I want an array of all the images in my file, wherever they might be. I know that the tree structure, the DOM structure of my file, is inside store pics. I know I want the image tags. So I tell Yahoo util selector query, give me all the image tags out of store pics and stick it into the all images array. And this is one of the main reasons why people use libraries, because all I have to do is this one line and I can eliminate all that other stuff from my code. So this ends up being considerably shorter than it would be otherwise. Now I want to add a little bit more here because, yes, now it's in all images, but we still need to do something with it now. So I say for var I equals 0, I less than all images dot length. That's how many images we have in the file. I plus plus. I want to set up a new variable called new image equals all images I new image dot set attribute. We're setting attributes of each of the thumbnails now that are going to be in that picture bar at the bottom. So we need to give it a new attribute. That new attribute is going to be width. And the value of it is equal to all images I dot get attribute width divided by 4. Every thumbnail in that bottom bar is a 1/4 size image of the big pictures. So we're going to take the height and the width attributes off the large picture that we're reading in, and then shrink it down by 1/4 for the height and width. And because we're about to do this for the width, we can just copy and paste height and height. Now we've set the height and the width to be 1/4 the value of the full-size image. Next, we want to be able to refer to this later. So we say new image dot set attribute ID, and we'll call the ID of this pic plus I. So it'll be pic 0, pic 1, pic 2, pic 3, all the way to the end. And that way each will have a unique ID, but it'll also be one that we know about. And then I say small pics dot append child new image. And there is our entire setup for our slideshow, except for one small bit. Before we end up setup pics, I want to call new slide in, because when we first load the page, you want to have a slide come up. And that's all you need to do with this code to be able to have a new slide come in. And here's our run slideshow image offset. We know they've clicked either the next or previous button to get here. We know that they're passing in a +1 or a -1. But still, because we've loaded a slide, the very first thing when we loaded the page, anytime they click next or previous, we know the first thing we need to do is move the old slide out. So we'll call old slide out. And that's a function we're going to have to create later. And now we need to figure out what the next slide is going to be. The simplest way to do that is to say current pic plus equals image offset. If we were on picture 10 and they pressed next, we're on 11. If we were on 10 and they picked previous, the -1 being passed in with a plus add to curpic ends up with curpic being equal to 9. And that's what we wanted. There's just one small problem, which is if we go too high or too low. So we need to add just a smidge of code to work around that. What we're going to do here is add a simple switch case statement that's a little bit weird, but it should be pretty clear when you look at it. Switch true. So the switch is always going to happen. Our first case is going to be cur pic equals all images dot length. So for instance, we know we have 18 pictures here that are numbered 0 through 17. If we've gone to 18, so the two are equal, we want to start over again at 0. So if that's the case, set cur pick equal to 0, break, and that's the end of that case. Next off, there's case cur pick less than 0. So you were at 0, you hit previous, and that throws you at -1. Now that's not valid. So in that situation, we need to set cur pick equal to all images dot length -1. So in this case, all images dot length is 18, 1 less than that is 17, and that's what we should get if we were at 0 and hit previous. And that's the end of the switch, and that's the end of run slideshow. Nearly last, here's our function new slide. We need a variable that we'll call docPick, and that is going to be document.get element by ID pick plus cur pick. Remember that our thumbnails can be pick 0, pick 1, pick 2, all the way up to, in this case, pick 17. So docPick is going to get this picture out of the document. Then, given that, we do document.get element by ID pick mover. That's the picture that's actually doing the moving around. Dot source equals docPick.source. Next, we start setting up the animation. You say var myanim equals new yahoo dot util dot motion, and that gets passed document dot get element by ID of pick mover. And we're going to need the height and width. So we set var the width to parseInt. ParseInt takes the integer portion of some variable, for instance a string variable, and make sure it's a number. So we need to make sure this is a number. So we need docPick dot get attribute width. And then we need to do the same thing for height, so we might as well just copy and paste the height and height. So now we need to set some attributes for the animation. The height, for instance, we need to set both the height it's starting at and the height it's finishing at, because if you recall, the image grew. Again, also for the width, we need to set a beginning and an ending size. And we also need to set points, because if you recall, it came flying up from the thumbnail bar up into the big main area. So we have to set several attributes, and these are all put into myanim attributes dot height, and it is set to braces to the height times 4. If you recall, the height of the thumbnails was 1/4 size. So now to bring it back out, we're going to have to multiply it by 4 from the height. And so that's how the height knows what size to start at and what size to end at. Same thing for width. There's width to the width times 4 from the width. And lastly, but a little bit more complexly, myanim.attributes.points. We pass it a to and from with the top left corner of where we want it to begin and where we want it to end. So it's set to 2. You'd think it'd be kind of hard to calculate exactly where the top left position is, both beginning and ending, but thankfully, Yahoo's figured out how to do that for you again. So we'll say yahoo.util.dom.getXY. And we want to end up is document.getElement by ID of the big pic. And where we want to start at, we can get to by saying yahoo.util.dom. That should be capital D, lowercase om, .getXY, and pass it in docpic, no semicolon there. And that is all that attributes needs. And my animation needs a couple more things. Duration is how many seconds do you want this to last? Let's say 2.0 for 2 seconds. My anim.method, let's do something tacky. yahoo.util.easing.bounceout. So it bounces on the outward bound part of when the image arrives. And finally, we say my anim.animate. And that's all that's needed for new slide in. If you notice, the fact that we're using the Yahoo stuff, there may only be 1, 2, 3, 4 lines that explicitly call a Yahoo functionality here. But on the other hand, if we had had to write this all from scratch ourselves, this file would be several hundred times its size, most likely. Now there's one last thing finally we need to do, and that's create one more function called oldSlideOut. So, because it's simpler, we'll just copy and paste and turn new slide in to be our template for oldSlideOut. Our docpic assignment is the same. GetElement by ID for pic mover is the same. My anim is the same. The width and the height are the same. It's a pretty good template. My anim.attributes height, we start off with a 2 of the height. Up in new slide in, our 2 was height times 4, and our from is the height. Down here, our 2 is the height, so our from is the height times 4. And that way, they balance each other out. So you can just take that times 4 and move it to the from. The from is always going to be the big one when we're moving out, and it's going to be the large one when we're moving in. And similarly, our points are 2 is going to be getXY docpic, and our from is going to be the getElement by ID big pic. Our duration, again, is 2.0. And our method this time, let's say, ease in strong. Nice, interesting one. You can find out what options there are for easing simply by looking in the Yahoo Docs on the cheat sheet or in the animation section of the documentation. They have a lot of them, some tasteful, some less so. And then we do the animation to do the slide out. Now there's one last thing. By now you might be wondering, if you've been paying close attention, where are we calling new slide in? Up above, you may have seen that in Run Slideshow, we started off by saying old slide out. But there's no new slide in at the end of Run Slideshow, as you might expect. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that during these 2 seconds, the browser is going off and doing stuff. It's doing its animation. But the browser is still also running any JavaScript. So if you just said, old slide out, new slide in, the new slide in would start activating only a tiny fraction of a second after old slide out had started, and the old slide out would never finish. So what we need to do is tell the new slide in animation to not start until the old slide out animation is done. So the way we do that is by saying myAnim.onComplete.subscribe and then passing it new slide in. And that just says when this animation is done, when it's completed, something wants to pay attention to this. Something is listening for it. And what's listening for it is new slide in. So the minute old slide out is done, new slide in automatically starts in by itself. So you don't have to call it anywhere else. And this code in between here will be long done before new slide in starts. So that's all of our JavaScript and AJAX and UI code. It looks like 88 lines of code, and it would probably be considerably more than that if we'd had to do it by hand. Thankfully, we didn't, and in our next lesson, we're going to test it and see how it goes. And finally, we get to the fun point, where we can actually see what all our hard work has led up to. So let's paste in the URL. If you're following along with the exercise files, this is ajax/chapter08/06/script.html in the browser. And when I load it, the thumbnails all load in across the bottom, and we get our previous and next buttons. I can start off by going previous, and it slowly moves down, and the next one pops over from the right. And if I click previous again, keep an eye out and you'll notice that we get an image of a different size. And it's worth checking out that that works because you'll find that most slideshows do not have every image the same. So it's looking like everything is working fine, or at least what we expect. And if we click through a little more quickly, we'll just skip ahead. And it looks like everything's working. So you can see that using the Yahoo User Interface Library, we were able to write our code much more quickly, much more stably, know that it works in considerably more browsers, and end up with something that looks pretty cool. In addition, it's easy to modify going forward. And that's all. Next up is closing. Well, you've made it all the way through the course, and now you may be wondering, where can I learn more about AJAX and JavaScript? Here's my recommendation of where to start looking, which is javascriptworld.com. And I only partly say that because, well, it's my own site. If you want to learn more, come to this site, and then you can click here over on the left on Where to Learn More. Underneath that, there's a number of resources. For instance, under Sites, there's links to references and blogs by companies such as Microsoft and Apple. There are links to the Yahoo libraries that we've looked at throughout this course, and links about AJAX, such as the AJAXian blog. If you're interested in, say, looking at a book instead, besides my own book, JavaScript and AJAX for the Web Visual Quick Start Guide, by Tom Negrino and myself. Here's a number of other books that we recommend, many of them by people we know personally, and there's some very smart people there. This has been the essential training, but it's just been a quick overview of all it is possible with AJAX. So now that you've gotten your feet wet, dive in and do some more research and have fun with AJAX. Well, now that you've made it to the end of AJAX Essential Training, you can consider yourself an AJAX programmer. We've barely gotten into some of the things that can be done with AJAX, So have some fun and discover all there is that can be done. I'm sure there's still lots of things that nobody's even thought of yet that you might be the one to do. And remember that all of the scripts you've done throughout this course are yours to do whatever you want with. So put them up on the web and show other people what cool stuff you can do. Enjoy!